They said she only knew how to cook, that she was fat, slow, and wasted the family's food on meaningless things. Her husband was ashamed of her. The neighbors laughed behind her back. No one in Iron Ridge believed her until the most brutal winter in history struck, and the plague swept through every house. Then, the only person standing between life and death wasn't the doctor, wasn't the mayor, but the woman they had all once looked down upon. Like, comment, and tell me where you're viewing this story from so I know how far it's come. And don't go anywhere because this story will change the way you see the people around you forever.
Says.
The jar slipped. It happened so fast that Mara didn't even have time to reach for it. One moment it was balanced on the edge of the cellar shelf, and the next it had shattered against the packed earth floor, pale golden broth spreading in a slow, steaming pool around her boots. She stood very still for a moment, watching the liquid soak into the dirt, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with grief over the lost jar. It was the smell. Rich, warm, deeply savory. The smell of rendered bone and dried thyme, and a long, slow simmer that had lasted the better part of a Tuesday. 6 hours she had spent on that batch. 6 hours with the kitchen hot enough to make her hair stick to the back of her neck, stirring, skimming, adjusting, tasting until it was exactly right. And now it was gone, soaking into the ground of a cellar that no one in Iron Ridge knew existed except her. She bent down and picked up the largest shard of glass carefully, set it on the shelf beside the remaining jars, and took a slow breath. 41 jars left on that row. 41, plus the rows behind it, plus the dried goods stacked along the far wall, plus the smoked meat hanging from the ceiling beams in the back corner, plus the root vegetables packed in sawdust in the wooden crates her father had built 30 years ago and left her when he died. It would be enough. She didn't know enough for what, exactly. She just knew it would be enough. Iron Ridge, Wyoming sat in a wide valley between two ridgelines that the locals called the Brothers, though no one alive could remember why. The town had grown up around a trading post and a well, and over 40 years it had accumulated a general store, a livery, a two-room clinic run by a doctor named Aldous Crane, a blacksmith, 3 saloons of varying respectability, a schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, and approximately 230 souls who had arrived from somewhere else and decided, for one reason or another, that this particular patch of high-altitude Wyoming was where they intended to stay. It was not a prosperous town. It was not a desperate one, either. It existed in the particular condition of most frontier settlements in the 1880s, somewhere between those two states, surviving on stubbornness and proximity to a trade route, always one bad winter away from serious trouble, but always having managed so far to avoid it. Mara Whitlock had lived in Iron Ridge for 9 years, since the autumn she married Gavin Mercer, and took his name and moved into his house on the eastern edge of town, the one with the warped front porch and the view of the ridge that turned pink in the late afternoon. She had come from a family of German settlers 2 counties east, the kind of people who put up food like it was a moral obligation, who kept cellars that could sustain them for a hard season before they went looking for help from anyone. Her mother had taught her how to render lard, how to cold pack vegetables, how to make a broth that could keep a sick person's body from giving up on itself. Her grandmother had taught her things that went back further, remedies and preparations that the women in their family had carried across an ocean and through a generation of hardship and never thought to write down because they had been passed hand to hand, season to season, since before anyone could remember. Mara had brought all of it with her when she came to Iron Ridge, and she had been putting it to use ever since, quietly, in the kitchen of the house with the warped porch. The problem was that Gavin didn't see it that way. What? You used the last of the marrow bones. He said it the way he said most things, flat, direct, without looking up from whatever he was doing, which on this particular evening was mending a length of harness leather at the kitchen table. The late October light was thin and yellow through the window, and the kitchen smelled of the broth Mara had been simmering since mid-morning. I did, Mara said. She was ladling the finished broth into jars at the counter, working carefully, her hands steady despite the weight of the heavy pot. We needed those bones for soup this winter. This is soup this winter. She set down the ladle and turned to look at him. This is better than soup this winter, Gavin. This keeps. He looked up then, and his expression was the one she had learned to read in 9 years of marriage. Not angry, exactly, not unkind, just fundamentally unconvinced. Gavin Mercer was a lean, practical man who had grown up on a homestead where waste was a catastrophe and excess was a fantasy, and he had built his entire understanding of the world around those two facts. He was not a cruel husband. He worked hard. He was faithful and sober and usually fair. But he looked at Mara's cellar the way some men looked at extravagant spending, like something that felt good in the moment but would end in suffering. "We have 43 jars down there already," he said, "and now you're adding more. Mara, that's food we could be eating now. That's food we might need in February," she said, "or January, or December if it comes early. It comes early every year. Then we'll have it ready." He set down the harness. "How much is enough?" "That's what I'm asking you. How much is enough before you stop? Because it seems to me like you just keep going and there's no end to it." Mara looked at him for a moment. She thought about trying to explain the feeling that drove her, the low, persistent hum of certainty that had been living in her chest since late summer, the way she woke up some mornings and lay in the dark listening to the sound of the wind and felt something in her body that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it either. She thought about trying to describe how she'd watched the elk move this fall, how they were moving wrong, too early and too fast, pressing south weeks before they usually did, how the berries on the high ridge had ripened and gone early, how the sky had a color some evenings that she didn't have a name for, but that made her want to go down to the cellar and count things. She thought about saying all of that. "I'll know when it's enough," she said instead, and turned back to her jars. Gavin picked up the harness. Neither of them said anything more about it that night. The next morning, Mara took 2 jars of broth to Agnes Pullman, who lived 3 houses down and was recovering from a chest cold that had been dragging on for 3 weeks. Agnes was 61 years old and had come west with her husband 20 years ago, and her husband had died of a snakebite 6 years after that, and she had stayed anyway because there was nothing to go back to. She was sharp and funny and occasionally vicious in her opinions, and she had been one of the first people in Iron Ridge to be kind to Mara when Mara arrived as a new bride who didn't know anyone. "You don't have to keep doing this," Agnes said, but she held the door open and let Mara in. "I know," Mara said, setting the jars on Agnes's kitchen table. "People are going to talk. They already talk. They say you're wasting Gavin's supplies. They say a lot of things." Mara sat down in the chair across from Agnes and folded her hands in her lap. "How's the cough?" "Still there. Gets worse at night." Agnes lowered herself into her own chair, moving carefully the way she had started doing in the last year, favoring her left hip. "Mara, I'm serious. Dorothy Briggs told Esther Cole that your husband complains about your cooking at the saloon, that you waste more food than you serve." Mara absorbed this. It wasn't news exactly. She had known for a long time that Gavin's frustration with her extended beyond their kitchen, that it lived somewhere in him that was connected to something older than food and supplies, something about how she was supposed to fit into the shape of life he'd imagined when he married her. She was not the wife he'd expected. She was large and quiet and spent more time in her cellar than in the parlor, and she did not apologize for any of it, and she suspected that was the part that bothered him most. "The broth is good for the cough," Mara said. "Drink it warm, twice a day. It won't cure it, but it'll help your body fight." Agnes looked at the jars. "Where do you even learn these things?" "My mother, my grandmother before her." Mara stood. Women who couldn't afford to let people get sick and stay sick. The town's opinion of Mara Whitlock could be summed up fairly quickly if you asked the right people at the right time. Ruth Alderman, who ran the general store with her husband Pete, thought Mara was eccentric but harmless. "She's always in here buying dried herbs and salt by the pound," Ruth had said more than once. "Strange woman, but she pays her bill." Tom Briggs, who owned the largest cattle operation near Iron Ridge and considered himself the closest thing the town had to an authority, had stronger views. "Mercer's wife is a problem," he'd told Pete Alderman once, leaning on the store counter. "She's got that man henpecked something terrible. You see the way she runs through their supplies? She'll eat them out of house and home, and then wonder why they're short come spring." Which was rich, coming from Tom Briggs, who had a wife and 4 children, and a foreman and 2 ranch hands, and still managed to show up at the church ladies' charity drive every year, expecting a free hamper. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Clara Finch, who had arrived from Ohio the previous spring, had a different take. She'd stopped by Mara's house once to return a bowl she'd borrowed, and Mara had invited her in for tea and sent her home with a jar of pickled beets and a packet of dried chamomile and specific instructions for making a sleep tincture. She's unusual, Clara had told her friend in a letter, but I like her. She knows things that aren't in any book I've ever read. Most of the town, though, was closer to Tom Briggs than to Clara Finch in their assessment. Mara was too big, too quiet, too interested in her cellar, and too unbothered by what anyone thought of her. On the frontier, where survival was communal and deviation from the norm carried real social costs, these qualities made people uncomfortable. And when people were uncomfortable, they talked. She was that Mercer woman. She was Gavin's wife, the one who cooks all day. She was the woman who brought soup to sick neighbors when they didn't ask for it, who showed up at a difficult birth with herbs and instructions when the midwife was occupied, who could tell you the shelf life of every preserved food in a 50-mile radius and had opinions about it. She was, in the estimation of Iron Ridge, a bit much. She was also, though no one would have said it this way at the time, the only person in the valley who was paying attention. Autumn. The autumn of 1886 was deceptive. It came in warm and golden, with clear skies that lasted through September and into October, and people in Iron Ridge relaxed in the way people relax when the weather is kind. They assumed it would continue, or at least continue to be manageable, and they made their plans accordingly. Mara did not relax. She had been watching the signs since August, and they were not good. The behavior of the wildlife she had mentioned to no one except Agnes. But there were other things too. The way the old-timers in town, the few who had been here long enough to have memory that went back before the town had a name, had grown quiet in a particular way. Old Hector Boss, who had trapped this valley for 20 years before he settled in Iron Ridge, and now spent most of his time on the bench outside the general store, had said something to Mara in September that she had not forgotten. "You feel it?" he'd asked, squinting at the too blue sky. "Yes," she'd said. "Building," he said. "The kind of winter that doesn't ask permission." She had gone home and spent the rest of September doing the math. How many people in Iron Ridge? How many of them had adequate food stores? How many would struggle if the passes closed early and the supply wagons couldn't get through? How long a serious illness could last? What the body needed to fight, what it needed to recover, how you kept a person alive when medicine ran out and there was nothing left but the stubbornness of whoever was caring for them. She had made lists. She had adjusted her preparations. She had started rising earlier to extend her working hours, slipping down to the cellar before Gavin woke so she could inventory and plan without the weight of his disapproval in the room. And she had kept her mouth shut, because she knew what happened when she tried to explain. She had tried once, in early October, at a dinner when Gavin had brought home Pete Alderman and Tom Briggs for a conversation about the upcoming cattle sale, and she had made the mistake of mentioning her concerns about the winter. Tom Briggs had laughed. Not cruelly, just the way a man laughs when something strikes him as transparently absurd. "Mara," he'd said with the kind of patience a person uses on a child, "this valley has had hard winters for 40 years and we've always managed. That's what frontier people do. We manage." "I know," she'd said. "I'm just saying that managing is easier if you're prepared." "We are prepared. We're always prepared." He turned back to Gavin. "You need to get that woman out of the kitchen more. She's got herself worried over nothing." Gavin had said nothing. He'd just refilled Tom's glass and changed the subject, and Mara had cleared the plates and gone back to the kitchen, and that was that. She added more salt to her order at the general store the following week. Ruth Alderman had raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. But November came in quietly, which was the worst sign of all. The old-timers knew this. A quiet November on the high plains was not gentleness, it was delay. The way a long inhalation precedes a shout. Mara felt it in the air each morning when she stepped out to the well. A quality of stillness that was not peaceful but held, suspended, like something balanced on an edge. She worked faster. There was a science to what she did, though no one who watched her would have called it that. It was the science of women who had spent generations keeping families alive through things that the history books didn't bother to record. The detailed, patient, unglamorous work of understanding what a body needs and making sure it's available when the body needs it. Bone broth. Because the gelatin and minerals helped a sick person's gut work well enough to absorb other food. Fermented vegetables. because something in them supported the body's ability to fight illness in ways that Mara could observe but not name. Dried herbs, thyme, elderberry, yarrow, echinacea, that she ground and mixed and stored in labeled packets according to their purpose. Foods that were dense with sustenance but stable over months. Dried beans, smoked meat, rendered fat, preserved fruit. She was not a doctor. She had no formal training of any kind. What she had was a particular quality of attention, the ability to watch, to listen, to remember, to connect what she knew with what she was seeing, and to act on it before other people had identified the problem. This quality, in a man with a title, would have been called expertise. In Mara Whitlock, it was called a waste of time. The first snow came on the 14th of November, which was early but not alarming. A 6-inch fall that turned Iron Ridge briefly beautiful before being packed down by foot and hoof traffic into the gray slush that characterized a frontier town in winter. Mara used the day of the snowfall to finish the last of her major preparations. She spent the morning in the cellar doing a full inventory, writing everything down in the ledger she kept on the top shelf. 87 quarts of bone broth in various strengths, 34 quarts of chicken broth, 46 quarts of vegetable preparations for the sick, 23 jars of rendered tallow, 18 jars of lard, 41 jars of preserved vegetables across 11 varieties, 29 jars of fruit preserves and dried fruit preparations, 112 pounds of dried beans and lentils in cloth sacks, 40 pounds of dried corn, 28 pounds of salt-cured meat, and a substantial collection of dried herbs organized by purpose. She stood in the cellar with the ledger open and the candle throwing her shadow large against the packed earth wall, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, more like the feeling of having done what you could and accepting that the rest was out of your hands. She closed the ledger and went upstairs to make dinner. "You were counting again," Gavin said that evening. He hadn't been home when she came up from the cellar, but he had apparently come in while she was at the stove, and he had noticed her boots near the cellar door. He knew her habits. "Finishing up," she said. "Finishing up what, exactly?" He set his coat on the hook and came into the kitchen, looking at her the way he'd been looking at her lately, like he was trying to solve a problem he couldn't quite define. "You've been down there every day this week." "I know." She kept her eyes on the pot. "I wanted to make sure everything was in order." In order for what? She turned around. She had been thinking, since September, about how to answer this question if he asked it directly, and she had never come up with a satisfying answer. Because the honest answer was, "I don't know exactly. I just know something is coming," and she knew what he would do with that. He would say it was worry. He would say she had always been like this, too anxious, too focused on disasters that hadn't happened yet. He would say it gently, because he was not a cruel man, but he would say it. "For winter," she said. "We have food for winter. We've always had food for winter. We have more this year. We have too much this year. Mara, that cellar is, He stopped and she could see him choosing his words. "It's not normal. What's down there is not a normal amount of food for two people." "No," she agreed. "It's not." "Then what is it for?" She turned back to the stove. "I don't know yet." The silence stretched between them, and then Gavin sat down at the table and didn't say anything more, and Mara served dinner, and they ate in the particular quiet of two people who have said enough and know that saying more won't help. The second snow came on the 22nd of November, and it was different from the first. Mara woke at 4 in the morning with the feeling that something had changed, and she lay in the dark listening. The wind had picked up in the night. She could hear it working at the corners of the house, a low, purposeful sound that she recognized the way she recognized the smell of the broth she'd been making for 20 years. Not casual wind, intent wind. She got up quietly and went to the window. The snow was falling horizontally. Not the soft, vertical fall of an ordinary storm. This was driven, thick, dense with purpose, the kind of snow that didn't ask permission before it rearranged the world. The brothers were already invisible. The nearest house, which was the Pullmans, was reduced to a faint dark shape through the white. She stood at the window for a long moment, and then she went downstairs to the kitchen and built up the fire, and sat down at the table with her ledger and a cup of hot water, and began to plan. By the time Gavin came downstairs at 7, she had rewritten her inventory and reorganized it by priority. What would be needed first? What could wait? What was most critical for someone who was sick versus someone who was healthy and working? She had calculated rough rations for emergency distribution. She had drafted, in the margins of the ledger page, a list of households in Iron Ridge that she was most worried about. Agnes Pullman, the Finch household, old Hector Boss, the Kowalski family, who had 5 children and a husband who had been struggling with a bad cough since October. Gavin stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her. "You've been up for hours," he said. "Yes." "Is it bad out?" "It's bad," she said. "And it's going to get worse." He went to the window and looked. She watched his face change, the slow recalibration of a practical man when practical evidence contradicted his expectations. He was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said finally, "we'll manage." Mara looked down at her ledger. "Yes," she said, "we will." But she was already thinking about the Kowalski children, and the way Mr. Kowalski had been coughing, and whether the chest congestion she'd observed in him was the kind that stayed localized or the kind that spread. She was thinking about how many doses of her thyme and elderberry preparation she had stored, and whether it would be enough if the whole family came down at once. She was thinking about Agnes Pullman's bad hip and how she would manage the snow between her door and her well if the storm went on for more than a few days. She was thinking about all of it while Gavin stood at the window and watched the snow fall, and neither of them knew yet how long the storm would last, or what it would bring with it, or how many people in Iron Ridge would spend the next weeks discovering that the woman they had spent years dismissing was the only reason any of them had a chance. The storm continued for 3 days, not without pause. There were hours when it lightened to a steady fall, almost gentle, and then picked up again before anyone had time to take that gentleness for a signal. By the end of the first day, the snow was 18 inches deep in the streets of Iron Ridge. By the end of the second day, it was past the lower hinge of most front doors, and the men who went out to tend livestock were navigating by feel and familiarity because the familiar landmarks had been swallowed. The brothers were gone. The ridgeline to the east was gone. Iron Ridge had become a small collection of yellow-lit windows in an enormous white silence. Mara went to Agnes on the second day, pushing through the snow with a sack over her shoulder and the cold so sharp it made her lungs hurt. She brought 2 jars of broth and a pot of bean stew she'd made that morning and a packet of herbs, and she spent an hour with Agnes in the warm, dim kitchen, checking the state of Agnes's stores and making a quiet mental note of what was there and what wasn't. "You're going to be all right," she told Agnes. "You have enough for 2 weeks at least, and I'll come back before then." "I'm not worried about me," Agnes said. "I'm worried about you walking around in this weather. Gavin know you're out here?" "He knows." "Is he worried?" Mara thought about the look on Gavin's face when she'd put on her coat that morning. Not warm, not supportive, but not stopping her either. Somewhere between those two things, which was where they spent most of their time lately. "He manages," she said. Agnes made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That man doesn't know what he has," she said. Mara didn't answer that. She tied her scarf tighter and let herself out into the cold. On the third day of the storm, the first person in Iron Ridge got seriously sick. It was Marcus Kowalski, as Mara had feared. The cough she'd been watching since October, which had seemed to stabilize through November, suddenly worsened. His wife, Helena, came to Mara's door at dusk on the third day of the storm, red-faced from the cold and clearly frightened, her words coming out in fragments. He can't catch his breath, and I don't know what to do, and the doctor—" "Has anyone been to Dr. Crane?" "We tried. Jonas went this morning, but the snow, he couldn't get through. The drifts on the north end are—" "All right." Mara was already moving, already reaching for her coat, already mentally calculating what she needed to take. "Go home. Get him sitting upright if you can, not lying flat. I'll be there in 10 minutes. "You don't have to—" "Helena," Mara looked at her. "Go home. Sit him up. I'll be right behind you." She was. She spent 4 hours with Marcus Kowalski that evening, working with the particular focused quiet of someone who has seen this before and knows what it requires. Steam, to open the airways. She showed Helena how to boil water and hold Marcus's head over it with a cloth tent. Warm broth every hour, the stronger batch, the one she'd made specifically with the immune-supporting herbs. She showed Helena which herbs to use and how to make a poultice for his chest, the kind her grandmother had made, the kind that smelled terrible and felt like warmth getting into the lungs from the outside. Marcus was frightened. That was the part people didn't talk about when they talked about illness on the frontier. How frightening it was to feel your body not working the way it should, especially in a place where the nearest hospital was a 3-day ride in good weather, and a 3-day ride was currently impossible. "Am I going to be all right?" he asked her. His voice was rough, and he was propped against the headboard with 2 pillows behind him, and his face was the gray-white color of a man running on empty. Mara looked at him honestly. "Your lungs are fighting," she said. "They need help. That's what we're going to give them." She paused. "You're not at the worst of it yet, Marcus, but if you follow the treatment and Helena keeps up the steam in the broth, you have a good chance of coming through before it gets there." He closed his eyes. "The children. I'll check on them before I leave." The children were fine, sniffly, tired, a little scared, but not sick in the way their father was sick. Mara left Helena with a full set of instructions and 3 jars of broth and a prayer that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the particular, fierce, helpless hope that comes from having done everything you can and knowing it might not be enough. She walked home through the dark and the cold and the snow, and she thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew that Marcus Kowalski was not alone. She knew, in the way she knew things, the aggregate of observation and instinct and the experience of 9 years of watching this town, that Marcus was the first, not the only. She had seen the way illness moved through a confined community in winter. She had watched it happen in the settlement where she grew up, the year she was 12, when something went through the valley and left half the families diminished. She knew what was coming. She had been preparing for it since August. The question, as she pushed open her own front door and stepped into the warmth of the kitchen, was whether it would be enough. Gavin was awake. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a lantern and a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, and he looked up when she came in, and for a moment his face did something complicated that resolved into the default expression of careful distance he'd been wearing for weeks. "How is he?" Gavin asked. "Fighting." She took off her coat and hung it up. Her hands were cold and she held them near the stove. "He needs a few more days of care to get through the worst of it." "Helena can't do it alone?" "She can. I'm going to help her." Gavin turned his glass on the table, a small rotation, twice. "We have our own house to maintain, Mara." "I know. The animals need—" "I know, Gavin. I know what we have to maintain." She turned to face him. "Marcus Kowalski has 5 children and his lungs are filled with fluid and his wife is terrified. I know what we need to maintain. I also know what they need." He said nothing. "There are going to be others?" she said quietly. "Marcus isn't the last. I don't know how many, but I know there are going to be others, and I know that when there are, what I have in that cellar is what's going to matter." Gavin looked at her. She could see him weighing it, the practical calculations he did constantly, the cost-benefit mathematics of frontier survival. She watched the calculation happen and didn't try to influence it. Either he understood or he didn't. She couldn't make him see it. "You've been planning for this," he said, not accusatory, just realizing. "Since August," she said. Another silence. Then, "The cellar." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the whiskey and drank it in one swallow and set the glass down and stood up. "All right," he said. He went to the bedroom. Mara stood at the stove and warmed her hands and listened to the storm working at the corners of the house, and thought about August and the way the elk had moved wrong, and all the months of early mornings and full jars and a husband who didn't understand and a town that didn't see her. She was not angry about any of it. Anger was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She was tired, and she was afraid, and she was ready. The storm broke on the 4th day, but it didn't leave. That was the thing about the kind of winter old Hector Boss had been describing on his bench outside the general store. It didn't arrive all at once and announce itself and stay. It came in waves, each one retreating just far enough to let people believe the worst was over, and then returning before they'd finished digging out from the last one. 3 days of driving snow, 1 day of pale gray stillness, 2 more days of snow. A morning of weak sunlight that made the drifts glitter and gave people a few hours of false hope, And then the clouds moved back in from the northwest, and the wind came with them, and the snow started again. By the first week of December, Iron Ridge had received more snowfall than it typically saw in an entire winter, and the winter had barely started. Mara was out every day. She had established a route, not formally, not written down anywhere, just a pattern she followed as naturally as a river follows its course. Agnes Pullman first because Agnes was the closest, and because Mara had known since October that Agnes's chest cold had never fully resolved and could become something worse. Then the Kowalski house, where Marcus was improving slowly, with the particular 2 steps forward, 1 step back rhythm of a man whose lungs had taken a serious insult and were not prepared to forgive it quickly. Then a sweep through the eastern quarter of town, checking on the households she'd identified as most vulnerable. The elderly, the families with young children, the men who lived alone and were too proud to ask for anything and too stubborn to admit they were struggling. She brought broth. She brought herbs. She showed people how to use them, and she watched them practice until she was confident they could do it themselves. And she came back the next day and the day after that, and she kept going. Gavin watched this without comment for the first week. He was not a demonstrative man, and he had not become one, but he had also not tried to stop her, and he was doing more of the household work without being asked, tending the livestock himself so she didn't have to, keeping the fire stoked, having food on the table when she came home. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was accommodation. But from Gavin, accommodation was not nothing. The problem, as the second week of December began, was that Mara's route was getting longer. It was Helena Kowalski who told her about the Dreyer family. Mara had stopped in to check on Marcus. He was sitting up, eating, his color better, though the cough had not gone and likely wouldn't for some time, when Helena mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd heard the Dryers hadn't been seen in 3 days. "Which Dryers?" Mara asked. "Otto and Berta, the ones out on the western edge, near the ridge." Helena was rolling dough at her kitchen table, the children playing somewhere in the back of the house, the sound of their voices a small bright thing in the heavy quiet. "Their son usually stops by the store every few days. Pete Alderman said he hasn't been in since last week." Mara thought about the Dryers. She knew them by sight. Otto was a large, quiet man of about 60 who had come from Germany a decade ago. His wife Berta was small and meticulous and had opinions about pickling that Mara had found interesting, the one time they'd spoken about it at length. They had one son, Werner, who was in his 30s and worked the land with his father. Their place was on the far western edge of town, close enough to be considered Iron Ridge, but removed enough to be easy to miss. "When did you hear this?" Mara asked. "Yesterday evening. Mrs. Crane told me, at the well." Mara finished checking on Marcus, gave Helena another 2 jars of broth and a reminder about the steam treatments, and went to the Dryers. The walk to the western edge took 25 minutes through snow that was, in places, past her knees. She was wearing the heavy wool trousers she'd started wearing instead of skirts in early November, a decision that had raised exactly 2 eyebrows in town before the snow got bad enough that the women who'd raised those eyebrows were doing the same. She had good boots, her father's design, with oiled leather that turned water better than anything she'd found in a store. She had learned, years ago, how to move through deep snow without exhausting herself. The long, slow stride, the measured breathing, the body's weight shifted back just slightly to avoid breaking through the crust. She arrived at the Dryer place and stood for a moment looking at the house. No smoke from the chimney. The front door was clear of drifts, which meant it had been opened recently, which was something, but the window was dark and the livestock in the small pen beside the barn were making noise. The particular low, distressed noise of animals that haven't been fed or watered in too long. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder, and called out, "Mrs. Dryer, Berta, it's Mara Whitlock from town. I'm coming in." She opened the door. The cold inside the house was almost as bad as the cold outside. The fire had gone out. Not recently either, from the feel of the room. In the main room, she found Werner Dryer on the floor near the dead hearth, wrapped in a blanket, unconscious. His breathing was audible from the doorway, a wet, rattling sound that turned Mara's stomach with something beyond worry. She moved to him quickly, kneeling, checking his color and his temperature with the back of her hand against his forehead. Burning up. She found Otto in the bedroom, also in bed, conscious but barely. He looked at her when she came in with the unfocused confusion of a man whose fever had been running unchecked long enough to affect his thinking. Berta was beside him in the bed, smaller than Mara remembered, her breath shallow. Alive, but not by much. Mara stood in the doorway of that bedroom for about 3 seconds. Then she went to the hearth and built a fire. She spent 6 hours at the dryer place that day, which meant she didn't get home until the light was completely gone and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. She had done what she could, brought the fire up, melted snow for water, got warm broth into all 3 of them by degrees, made Werner as comfortable as she could manage while leaving him on the floor because she couldn't move him herself. She had left clear instructions written on the back of an envelope from her pocket, addressed to whoever came next, and she had come home and told Gavin and watched his face do its complicated thing again. All 3 of them, he said. Werner worst. If he doesn't improve in the next 24 hours... She stopped. Someone needs to get to Dr. Crane. The north drifts are still bad. I know. Someone needs to go anyway. Gavin was quiet. Then, I'll go first thing. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her, was looking at the fire, his jaw tight with something she couldn't quite read. Not the ordinary frustration of recent months, but something older and harder. The face of a man revising a calculation he had been confident about. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and didn't say anything more. Dr. Aldous Crane was a thin, precise man of 55 who had come to Iron Ridge a decade ago after losing a practice in Missouri under circumstances he never discussed. He was a competent physician, not brilliant, but competent, and more importantly, present, which in a frontier town was often the more critical quality. He had a clinic that was really just the front room of his house, equipped with what he'd been able to accumulate over 10 years of ordering supplies on a budget that was never adequate. And he had a manner with patients that was reassuring without being sentimental, which was exactly what people on the frontier needed. He had also, as of early December, begun to look tired in a way that was not ordinary tiredness. Mara noticed it when she stopped by the clinic after visiting the dryers. Gavin had reached him the day before, and Crane had gone out to the western edge himself, which was no small thing in those conditions. He was behind his desk when she came in, writing something in the cramped, efficient hand that doctors develop. And he looked up and she saw it immediately. The tightness around his eyes, the particular pallor of a man running on too little sleep and too much worry. How are they, she asked. Werner is the one I'm concerned about, Crane said. The lung involvement is significant. The parents will likely come through. Otto is stronger than he looks, and Berta's fever broke last night. He set down his pen. Werner needs intensive nursing care for the next week at minimum. Care I can't provide here because... He stopped. Because there are others, Mara said. He looked at her. You've been making rounds. Yes. How many? She had been keeping her own list, updated each day. Marcus Kowalski is improving. The dryers. I stopped by the Finch house yesterday. Clara has something starting in her chest, early stages. Old Hector Boss has a fever. The Lindqvist family on the south end, 2 children with high temperatures. She paused. Those are the ones I know about. There are likely more I don't. Crane was quiet for a moment. The nature of the illness, he said carefully, is respiratory. Serious respiratory infection spreading through close contact in cold conditions, which means anyone who's been in contact with an infected person before symptoms appeared. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. What do you need? Mara asked. He looked surprised. People didn't usually walk into his clinic and ask that. Medicine I don't have, he said. Quinine, laudanum, though I'm nearly out. More bandaging. Mustard for poultices. I have mustard. I have other things that can help. Not medicine. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to tell you I have medicine, but things that support the body while it fights. She leaned forward slightly. I have been preparing food stores since August, Doctor. More than enough for my household. I think they may be needed. Crane looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing it the way a practical man weighs something that doesn't fit neatly into his understanding of the world. Bone broth, she said. Fermented preparations, specific herbs. Nothing miraculous, just support. The kind that keeps a sick person's body from giving out while you're waiting for it to fight through. You know about the gelatin, he said slowly. The gut absorption. My grandmother knew about it. I know what I've seen. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you have." She told him. She watched his face as she listed it, and she could see him doing the assessment. The skepticism of a trained physician encountering folk knowledge, the pragmatism of a doctor who was running out of options, and something that might have been, underneath both of those, recognition. He had seen broth used this way. He had heard of it, at least. "I'll take the broth," he said finally. "For the clinic. The herbs. Tell me specifically what you have and what you use them for, and I'll tell you whether I want them. I can't endorse things I don't understand." "I'm not asking you to endorse anything," Mara said. "I'm asking you to let me help." He nodded. "All right." She stood to go. "Doctor." He looked up. "When's the last time you slept?" A short silence. "I'll sleep when I can." "That's not an answer."
No, he agreed. It's not.
The week before Christmas, Iron Ridge stopped being a town that had sick people in it and became a town that was sick. It didn't happen all at once. It crept, the way illness crept. One house, then two, then four, and then you realized that the number had crossed some invisible line and become something you couldn't manage case by case anymore. The Lindqvist children, then their parents. 3 men from the saloon on the North End who had been in close quarters and sharing glasses without thinking about it. The blacksmith, Clara Finch, 4 more families in the southern quarter, and somewhere in all of it, moving through the snow between houses with a pack on her back and a list in her head, Mara Whitlock. She had stopped thinking about her own fatigue somewhere around the second week of December. Not because she wasn't tired. She was tired in a way that had moved past ordinary exhaustion into something more fundamental, a weariness that was in her bones rather than her muscles. But she had also found, in those weeks, a kind of rhythm that sustained her. The route, the knock on the door, the assessment, the broth, the herbs, the instructions. The patient faces of people who were frightened and sick and did not know what to do, and the particular complicated feeling of being useful in a way that you had not been permitted to be useful before. Some of the conversations were hard. She went to a house on the North End one afternoon and found a man named Carl Whitmore, alone with 3 children under 8, his wife down with a fever so high she was delirious in the bedroom. Carl was not a man she'd ever spoken more than a few words to. He was one of the ones who'd made a comment early in her marriage that had gotten back to her, something about Gavin's wife and how she cooked like she was feeding an army for no reason. He was sitting at the kitchen table when she came in, and he looked up at her and his face went through several things in quick succession. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He'd used her first name once, she thought. He used it less often than most people. "Mrs. Whitlock," she said, because she had always used her own name and saw no reason to stop now. "Or Mara, if you prefer. How long has she been this way?" 2 days? His voice was rough. "I don't know what to do. The doctor came yesterday and he said he'd come back, but he's got so many. I know." She set her pack down and started taking things out. "I'm going to help you manage this. She's going to need steam and fluids above everything else. Do you have a large pot?" He got up and got her the pot without another word. She worked in the Whitmore house for 3 hours. She showed Carl how to do the steam treatment, standing over the task with the patience of a woman who had learned long ago that you don't resent the student for not knowing what you know. She showed him how to give his wife the broth by spoon when she wasn't conscious enough to drink from a cup. She checked the children, left herbs for their preventative tea, and made sure they had firewood stacked close enough to the hearth to last 2 days without anyone going out in the cold. When she was leaving, Carl stopped her at the door. "Mrs. Whitlock." He looked down at the floor, then up. He was a big man, the kind of big that comes from physical labor, and he looked, at that moment, about 12 years old. "I said something, a while back, about you and your cooking. I heard you found out." Mara looked at him. "It was a rotten thing to say," he said, "and He stopped. "Thank you for coming here anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "Your wife needs the broth every hour while the fever is up," she said. "The children should have the tea morning and evening. I'll come back tomorrow." She went out into the cold. It was Gavin who brought her news of the Hendersons. He had been doing more in the past 2 weeks than she had expected. Not just the household work, but quietly, without being asked, doing things that surprised her. He had gone to Otto Dreyer's place to tend the livestock 3 days running, because Werner was still too weak and Otto couldn't manage alone. He had helped dig out Mrs. Pullman's path to her well. He had, she discovered, brought a load of firewood to the schoolhouse when he heard it was being used as an overflow space for patients who couldn't be managed at home. He didn't talk about any of it. He just did it and came home and ate dinner in the kitchen with her. And sometimes in the evenings they sat together on the side of silence that was not estrangement but something more tentative. Two people in the same house, relearning the shape of each other. The night he told her about the Hendersons, she had been home for 2 hours and had already fallen half asleep at the kitchen table when he came in. "There's news," he said. She lifted her head. "Seth Henderson, he—" Gavin took off his coat. "He died this morning." Mara went still. Seth Henderson was 34 years old. He had a wife, Nora, and 2 daughters, 7 and 4. He ran a small freight operation out of a barn on the east side of town. She had not had him on her list. She hadn't known he was sick. "When did he get sick?" she asked. "Last week, apparently. Nora thought it would pass. She didn't want to make a fuss." Gavin sat down across from her. She sent word to Crane this morning when Seth stopped breathing. The silence in the kitchen was different from their usual silences. Heavier. "I didn't know," Mara said, which was also a kind of grief. The specific grief of someone who believed they had a system and found a hole in it. "You can't know everything," Gavin said. "I should have checked on them." "Mara." He said her name in a way he hadn't said it in a while. Not sharply, not with frustration underneath it, just plainly. Just her name. "You're one person." She looked at the table. "I know," she said. "I know I am." She sat with that for a moment. Then she got up and went to the cellar to check on what she had left and what she would need to make more of in the morning, because Seth Henderson was gone and she couldn't fix that, but there were other houses she hadn't been to yet and she would have to go to them in the morning and she needed to know what she had to bring. Gavin watched her go. She didn't see his face, but if she had, she might have seen something on it that was moving, slowly, from one thing to another, like ice that's been building pressure for months and has finally found the edge where it can begin to shift. She found Gavin in the cellar. She had come down before dawn the next morning, the way she always did, and found the lantern already lit. He was standing in front of the shelves with his arms crossed, looking at what was there. He turned when he heard her on the stairs. 61 quarts of broth, he said. "That's what I count." "How much are you using per week?" She blinked, came the rest of the way down the stairs. "Depends on how many people. Somewhere between 8 and 14 quarts right now." He nodded slowly, doing the math. "That gives us 4, maybe 5 more weeks if the number stays stable." "The number won't stay stable. It'll go up before it goes down." "How much up?" "I don't know. It depends on how fast it spreads and how long people stay sick." She came to stand beside him and they both looked at the shelves together. "I've been making more every day, but I can only produce so much with what we have. The bones." "I'll slaughter the second cow," Gavin said. She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the shelves. "It was going to be sold in spring," he said. "That was the plan. But the plan was made before this." He paused. "You need more bones. You need more meat for the sick families who are running out of their own. I'll slaughter the cow." She stood very still for a moment. She understood what that animal was worth. She understood the calculation he was making and what it cost him. "Gavin!" "I was wrong," he said. It came out flat and quiet, the way he said most things, but with a weight behind it that she felt in her chest. "I was wrong about the cellar, about what you were doing." He finally looked at her. "I don't know if I can explain why I couldn't see it. Maybe I didn't want to see it. Maybe it was, I don't know, pride, the way things are supposed to look." He paused. Seth Henderson was 34 years old. "Yes," she said. "I'll slaughter the cow tomorrow," he said. "You tell me what else you need." She told him. The week of Christmas was the worst of it. Not the worst of the weather, though the weather was bad. Another storm coming through on the 23rd and lasting 2 days, with temperatures that the older residents of Iron Ridge said they hadn't seen in 20 years. But the illness had reached a saturation point by then. had spread through enough of the town's households that there was no longer any question of managing it quietly, neighbor by neighbor. The clinic was full. The schoolhouse, which Tom Briggs had opened as an overflow space under considerable pressure from several directions, had patients in every corner. Dr. Crane was moving between locations on a schedule that left him perhaps 3 hours of sleep in every 24. And Mara was everywhere. She had recruited help, not formally, not with any announcement, just by the organic accumulation of people who watched what she was doing and found themselves unable to not participate. Helena Kowalski, whose husband was well enough to manage alone, joined her route in the second week and proved to have a calm, competent manner with sick people that Mara found genuinely useful. Ruth Alderman at the general store started setting aside supplies for Mara without being asked. Clara Finch, recovered now from her own illness, showed up at the Whitlock door one morning with her coat on and her jaw set and said, "Tell me what to do." "You just got well," Mara said. "Which means I can't catch it again," Clara said. "Probably. Tell me what to do." Mara told her. Tom Briggs was Harder's. He came to the clinic one afternoon when Mara was there delivering broth, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at what she had brought, and then he looked at her, and whatever he saw on her face, or maybe whatever he saw on the faces of the patients in the cots behind her, or maybe whatever he'd seen in his own household that week when his youngest had gone down with the fever, made him very quiet. "What do you need?" he said. It was not, she noticed, an apology. It was just a question. But it was the right question. "Firewood for the schoolhouse," she said, "and if you can spare any cattle bones from your operation, Dr. Crane could use the broth." She paused. "And someone should check on the families in the western quarter that we haven't been able to reach. The drifts on Birch Lane are still bad, and I can't get through with a loaded pack." Tom Briggs, who owned the largest cattle operation near Iron Ridge, and who had, 7 weeks ago, told Gavin Mercer to get his wife out of the kitchen more, sent 2 men with firewood to the schoolhouse that afternoon and a cart of bones to Mara's door the next morning. She used every bone. Dinchik. It was Agnes Pullman who said it one evening when Mara stopped to check on her and stayed too long. Stayed because she was tired and Agnes's kitchen was warm and Agnes had made coffee, and sometimes you needed 5 minutes of stillness before you could go back out. "You know what they called you," Agnes said. "Before all this." "I know what they called me." "You're not angry." Mara thought about it honestly. "I was, for a while. Early on." She looked at the coffee in her cup. "Then I got busy." Agnes looked at her. "That's not the whole answer." "No," Mara agreed. "The whole answer is—" She stopped. "It doesn't help anyone to be angry. The work is the work regardless of what people think of the person doing it." "That's very wise," Agnes said. "It's also not entirely true." Mara was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Not entirely." She sat with Agnes a little longer than she'd planned, and then she put on her coat and picked up her pack and went back out into the cold, and made the last 3 stops on her route, and came home long after dark to find Gavin asleep in the chair by the fire, his boots still on, his hands open in his lap. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him for a moment. Then she added wood to the fire and went to bed. Outside, the wind had dropped. The temperature was still brutal. Would be brutal for weeks yet, and there were people in Iron Ridge who were still in the middle of the worst of their illness, and there was no clear bottom to this yet, no certain point after which she could say, "It will get easier from here." But the broth was holding. The sick people who were getting it were fighting, and most of them were winning. Not all. Seth Henderson was gone, and there were 2 others she'd lost count of in the fog of those weeks. And she carried that weight in the specific way a person carries losses they believe they might have prevented if they had been faster, smarter, earlier. It was not a comfortable weight. She did not put it down. The morning Dr. Crane collapsed, Mara was 3 houses away. She heard about it secondhand from Werner Dreyer, who had finally recovered enough to move around and had taken to helping with small tasks, carrying wood, clearing paths, the work of a man rebuilding his strength in increments. He came to the Whitmore house, where Mara was checking on Nora Henderson's neighbor, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said it plainly, the way people on the frontier said difficult things, because there was no good way to dress it. "Crane went down," Werner said, "about an hour ago, at the schoolhouse." Mara set down the jar she was holding. "What happened?" "Fell. Right in the middle of checking on the Lindqvist boy." Werner's jaw was tight. Ruth Alderman was there. She said he just went down sideways. They got him to his house. His wife's with him. Is he conscious? Was, when they moved him. Barely. Mara stood very still for a moment. Through the window of the Whitmore house, she could see the schoolhouse at the end of the lane, smoke coming from its chimney, the gray shapes of people moving around inside. She had been in there that morning. 11 patients, 3 of them serious, 2 of those serious ones needing monitoring every few hours. Without Crane, the monitoring would fall to her and Helena and Clara, none of whom were doctors, all of whom were already stretched past what was reasonable. Who else knows? She asked. It'll be around town by noon, Werner said. She knew what that meant. She had watched, over the past 3 weeks, the particular arithmetic of morale in a crisis, how a community's ability to function was not just material but psychological, how the knowledge that there was a doctor in the clinic, tired and undersupplied as he was, had been holding people together the way a keystone holds an arch. Remove it, and the whole structure would feel the absence. All right, she said. She picked up her pack. I need to see him. Eleanor Crane was a small, composed woman who had the particular stillness of someone who had been managing difficult situations for so long that difficult situations no longer surprised her. She met Mara at the door of the clinic house with an expression that was controlled in the way of someone who is controlling it deliberately, and she stepped back to let Mara in. He won't like being seen this way, Eleanor said. I know, I'll be quick. Crane was in the back room, in the bed, and he looked worse than Mara had expected. Not the fever flush of the illness that was moving through town. This was different. This was exhaustion that had gone past the body's ability to compensate. The depletion of a man who had been running on will and obligation for 3 weeks and had simply run out of both. His face had a gray, sunken quality. He was conscious, though, and he tracked her when she came into the room. Don't, he said. His voice was barely there. Don't what? Don't look at me like a patient. I'm not a doctor, Mara said. I'm just looking at you like a person. She pulled the chair close and sat down. How long has this been building? A short silence. Longer than I'd like to admit. Have you been eating? When I remembered to, she absorbed this. The schoolhouse has 11 patients this morning. 3 need checking every few hours. The Lindqvist boy is the most critical. His fever spiked again last night, and I'm concerned about how he's breathing. She paused. What do I do if it gets worse? Tell me exactly. He looked at her. For a moment she thought he might push back. Might say, You're not trained. You shouldn't be the one making these calls. And she would have understood it, would have agreed with the technical truth of it, but they were past the point where technical truths were the most useful thing available. The fever, he said. Cold compresses to the neck and wrists, not the whole body. If he starts struggling for air, real struggling, not just the cough, get him upright as you can make him. The fluid needs to drain down, not stay in the upper lungs. He paused, gathering the energy for more. If anyone else spikes above what you can manage with the compresses, there's laudanum in the cabinet in the clinic room. Eleanor knows where. I trust you to be conservative with it. I will be. And the broth. He looked at the ceiling. Keep the broth going. I know I was skeptical in the beginning, but... He stopped. I've watched what it does. The people who are getting it regularly are fighting better than the ones who aren't. I don't know exactly why, and I'm not making any medical claims about it, but keep it going. I'll keep it going, she said. He closed his eyes. She sat for a moment, and then she stood. Mara. She turned. He was still looking at the ceiling. What's happening out there? What you've built. With the roots and the food and the people you've pulled in, I want you to know that I see it. A long pause. I should have said that sooner. She stood with that for a moment. Rest, she said. I'll come back tonight. She stood on the street outside the clinic house for a long time. The cold was the kind that came in through every gap. Cuffs, collar, the seam where her scarf didn't quite meet her coat. And the sky was a flat, featureless white that gave no hint of what time of day it was or what was coming. The town around her was quiet in the way it had been quiet for weeks, the particular muffled stillness of a settlement under heavy snow and heavier trouble. A man she didn't know well passed her on the lane and nodded and moved on. Smoke from a dozen chimneys went straight up into the still air. She thought about the schoolhouse with its 11 patients, and the 3 serious ones, and the Lindqvist boys' fever, and she thought about the route she still had to finish today, and she thought about her cellar and what was in it and what wasn't. Then she thought about something else. It had been forming at the back of her mind for days, weeks maybe, without her quite letting herself look at it directly, the way you avoid looking at something large that you're not sure you can deal with. She had been managing this in the only way she knew how to manage things, one house at a time, one jar at a time, one sick person at a time. It was the approach her mother had taught her, her grandmother before that. Small, consistent, sustained. But small and consistent and sustained had a ceiling, and she could feel it. She could not do this alone anymore. Not because she was unwilling. She would have kept going until she dropped, and she knew it, and that was part of the problem. She could not do this alone anymore because the situation had outgrown what one person, or 3 people, or 5 people doing their best could manage. And somewhere in the 3 weeks she had spent moving through this town, she had seen something that she hadn't entirely expected to see. People wanted to help. They didn't always know how. They were frightened, and some of them were proud, and some of them were stubborn in the particular frontier way that kept people alive in bad times, but made them resistant to accepting help or giving it in organized ways. But underneath all of that, underneath Carl Whitmore's shame and Tom Briggs's complicated pride and the general reticence of people who had come to this valley to be independent and had made independence into a kind of religion, there was something else. Something that showed up in the way Werner Dreyer had appeared at the schoolhouse 3 days after he could barely stand, asking what he could carry. In the way Ruth Alderman had started putting up a small pot of water at the store every morning for anyone who needed warm water and couldn't heat their own. In the way the 3 men from the saloon, once they'd recovered enough to be functional, had started showing up at the schoolhouse each morning without being asked and doing whatever needed doing. People wanted to help. They just needed someone to tell them how. She started walking, not toward the schoolhouse, not toward the next stop on her route, toward the general store. Ruth Alderman looked up from behind the counter when Mara came in, and her expression did the thing it had been doing lately when she saw Mara. A combination of relief and something close to guilt. The face of a woman who had spent years having mild opinions about Gavin Mercer's wife, and was now watching those opinions rearrange themselves into something less comfortable. "I need to use your store," Mara said. Ruth blinked. "Use it how?" "I need to send word to every household in Iron Ridge that can still get someone here. I need people to come to a meeting. Today, if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest." She paused. "I know that's a lot to ask." "What kind of meeting?" Mara told her. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she took off her apron, hung it on the hook behind her, and said, "Pete can watch the store. I'll go." The meeting happened the next morning in the schoolhouse, which was the largest covered space in town that wasn't already full of sick people. Mara had expected a fair number of people to find reasons not to come. The cold, the disruption, the general frontier reluctance to attend anything that smelled like a public gathering for purposes other than commerce or emergency. She had been wrong, which told her something about where the town was. 31 people came, out of a town of 230, with illness in perhaps a third of the households and deep snow between every door and every other. 31 people pulled on their coats and came to the schoolhouse. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them. Werner Dreyer, Helena Kowalski, with Marcus beside her, still coughing but upright. Clara Finch, Agnes Pullman, who had walked through knee-deep snow on a bad hip and whose expression dared anyone to comment on the fact. Tom Briggs in the back row with his arms crossed, looking like a man who had come to object and hadn't yet decided what to object to. Pete Alderman. 6 of the farmers from the outer edges of town. Carl Whitmore. 3 women from the South End whose names Mara knew but whose husbands she knew better. And Gavin, standing near the door with his hat in his hand, who had not asked her what she was going to say and whom she had not told. She did not make a speech. She was not a speaker, not in the way that some people were. She did not have the kind of voice that swelled to fill a room or the manner that made people feel they were being led somewhere exciting. What she had was simpler than that, and she suspected more useful. She told them the truth. "Dr. Crane is down," she said. He's not dead, but he won't be back on his feet for at least a week, possibly longer. Right now, there are 11 people in this schoolhouse who need nursing care that I cannot provide alone. And there are more in their houses who need food and broth and basic care that none of the 3 people currently on the route can cover. 2 days ago, I found out that Seth Henderson was sick and dying, and I didn't know, because he and Nora didn't want to make a fuss. She stopped. Seth Henderson is dead. I don't know if it would have made a difference if I had gotten there earlier. Maybe not. But I know I didn't get there, and I know why. And the reason is that this is too big for what we've been trying to do. The room was quiet. She looked at Tom Briggs in the back row. He had uncrossed his arms. I have food in my cellar, she continued. I've been preparing since August. I have enough broth to last another month at current distribution rates, and more if we extend it with the bones from Tom's operation. Thank you for those, by the way. A very small pause. Tom Briggs said nothing, but something moved in his face. What I don't have is enough hands. What I don't have is a system that reaches every household in this town before another person dies alone because they didn't want to ask for help. She let that sit for a moment. What I'm proposing, she said, is that we stop doing this the way we've been doing it. Each family managing alone, each person only knowing what's happening to their immediate neighbors, and start doing it together. A community kitchen. Right here, or at a location we agree on. My food stores combined with whatever anyone else can contribute. A shared production system for broth and meals. A rotation of volunteers for the nursing care at the schoolhouse and for the household rounds. An organized list of every resident in Iron Ridge so that no house goes unchecked for more than 2 days. She stopped talking. For a moment, nobody said anything. She could feel the room processing it. The specific weight of what she was asking, which was not small. She was asking people who had come to the frontier specifically to be independent, specifically to not need anyone else, to decide that they needed each other. She was asking Tom Briggs, who had a ranch and a foreman and a way of running things that suited him, to put his resources into a collective arrangement run by a woman he had dismissed for years. She was asking frightened, exhausted people to take on more. It was Werner Dreyer who spoke first. I'll do the morning run, he said, from the back, simply, without elaboration. I know the Western Quarter. I can cover it. Then Helena Kowalski. I'll take the nursing rotation at the schoolhouse. Marcus can manage alone. Then Clara Finch. I can organize the household list. I know the students' families. I have addresses for almost everyone. Then a long pause, and then Tom Briggs in the back row said, without uncrossing his recrossed arms, I'll send my men with whatever you need from the operation. Wood, bones, what have you. Another pause, shorter, and I'll put in a steer. The room shifted. Mara could feel it. That particular moment when the weight of a decision tips from one side to the other, when people who have been waiting to see which way the current runs finally commit to swimming. She looked at Gavin. He was still by the door. He met her eyes, and the look on his face was not simple. It was not warmth, not pride, not apology, but some combination of all 3 things and something harder to name. The look of a man who has revised something fundamental about what he understands and is still in the process of revising it. He gave her one small nod. My best cattle, he said. The one I was saving for spring sale. I'll slaughter it today. She had not asked him. She had not even looked at him with that expectation. He had simply decided. The room was completely quiet for a moment. Then Ruth Alderman said, I can give up the back room of the store for storage and preparation. It's warm and it's big. And then all 31 people in the schoolhouse started talking at once. The community kitchen came together in a way that was not, in Mara's later memory, remotely graceful. It was loud and disorganized, and people disagreed about where to put things and how to divide responsibilities and whether the Alderman store's back room was better than the schoolhouse annex. And there were 2 distinct moments in the first afternoon where she thought it was going to collapse under the weight of competing opinions before it ever properly started. The first moment was Tom Briggs. He had come to the store's back room that afternoon with 2 of his ranch hands and a list of suggestions about how the operation should be run. And the suggestions were not bad suggestions. Tom Briggs had been managing a large operation for 20 years, and he knew something about logistics. But he was presenting them in the way he presented most things, which was as conclusions rather than proposals, and Mara could feel the room stiffening around her. Tom. She said it quietly when he paused for breath. I appreciate this, genuinely, but I need to ask you something. He looked at her, slightly surprised at being interrupted. Can you cook? A short silence. No, he said. Can you make broth? Do you know the difference between a broth that will support a sick person's recovery and one that won't? A longer silence. No. Then we need your cattle and your men and your firewood and your organizational instincts, all of which are genuinely valuable. She kept her voice even. But the kitchen runs the way I know it needs to run, because that's what's going to keep people alive. Can we agree on that? She watched him. He was not a man who was accustomed to being told how things would work. She could see the moment of resistance, the flecks of it across his face, and then she could see it subside. Not because he'd been defeated, but because he was, underneath the pride and the habit of authority, a practical man. And practical men eventually followed evidence. Fine, he said. You run the kitchen. I'll handle the supply logistics. That's exactly what I need, she said. The second difficult moment was more personal and harder. It was in the evening, after the first real production run had finished. They had made 40 quarts of broth in the back room of the alderman's store, using the bones from Gavin's slaughtered cattle, and a method that Mara walked the volunteers through step by step, correcting and adjusting and demonstrating until she was confident that the 5 people who would be doing it tomorrow without her direct supervision could do it correctly. She was bone-tired, in the bone-deep way that had become familiar, and she was cleaning down the work surface when Ruth Alderman came to stand beside her. Can I say something? Ruth asked. Yes. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She had a dish towel in her hands that she was folding and refolding. I want to apologize, she said. For a long time I let people say things in my store about you, and I didn't correct them. She looked at the folded towel. I thought they were more or less right, that you were, I don't know, excessive. Mara kept cleaning. I was wrong, Ruth said. Mara stopped and looked at her. Ruth Alderman was a woman who had run a store on the frontier for 15 years, who had extended credit to families who couldn't pay and never made them feel small about it, who had quietly done more acts of practical generosity than most people knew. She was not a bad woman. She had just been, in the way most people were, limited by what she could see, and she had not been able to see Mara. You weren't the only one, Mara said, and I'm not in the business of keeping a list. Ruth looked up. Something in her face relaxed. I want to keep doing this after, Ruth said, after the winter. Whatever we build here, I want to keep it going. The store, the back room, whatever it needs to be. She paused. If you want that. Mara thought about it. Let's get through the winter first, she said, and then we'll talk about what comes after. The community kitchen was functional by the second day and chaotic by the third, and something close to efficient by the fourth. And in Mara's experience, this was about the natural speed of people learning to work together on something they hadn't done before. She established a system, because systems were what kept people from burning out and making mistakes in the middle of a crisis. 3 shifts of volunteers in the kitchen, rotating every 4 hours. A daily production target for broth, adjusted based on the previous day's distribution. A separate team for the household rounds, split by quarter so that no volunteer was traveling too far in a single circuit. A daily check-in at 6 in the morning before the first shift, where whoever had information from the previous day's rounds could share it, and the day's priorities could be adjusted accordingly. It was not a perfect system. People missed shifts. People made the broth too thin or too salty, or added the wrong herbs in the wrong proportions, and had to be corrected. There was a disagreement on the 3rd day between Werner Dreyer and Carl Whitmore about who was responsible for the western quarter of the household rounds that became heated enough for Mara to have to step in and draw a line on a piece of paper to settle it. The line was arbitrary. She just drew it where it seemed to divide the work roughly equally, and Werner and Carl both looked at it and agreed, slightly sheepishly, and went out on their respective circuits. She was not managing a perfect operation. She was managing a functioning one, and in a crisis, functioning was what mattered. 2. It was on the 5th day of the community kitchen that the Lindqvist boy, Eric, turned the corner. He was 7 years old, and he had been the most serious case in the schoolhouse, the one Crane had worried about most before he went down, the one Mara had been monitoring every 3 hours through 4 days and nights. His fever had broken twice and come back. And there had been a night, the third night, when the temperature outside had dropped to something that nobody wanted to put a number to, when she had sat beside his cot and watched him breathe and thought about Seth Henderson and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She had kept the steam going. She had gotten broth into him by the spoonful when he couldn't drink. She had slept 2 hours on the floor beside him and woken to check his temperature and gone back to sleep. Helena Kowalski had taken the shift after her, and Clara Finch after Helena, and between the three of them they had not left the boy unattended for more than 20 minutes in 4 days. On the 5th morning, his fever was down and holding. On the 6th morning, he opened his eyes clearly, not the confused, unfocused open of the past several days, but actually seeing. And he looked at Mara, who happened to be the one beside him, and he said, "I'm hungry." She sat back in the chair and let out a breath that she had been holding, she felt, for about 4 days. "That," she said, "is the best thing I've heard all week." She went and got him broth, and he drank it himself. And she stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse watching him drink and felt something unclenching in her chest that she hadn't quite realized had been clenched. Crane was back on his feet on the 8th day, thinner than he'd been and slower, but functional. He came to the community kitchen on the morning of the 9th day and stood in the doorway of the Alderman store's back room for a long moment, taking in what was happening. The volunteers at the tables, the steam from the pots, the organized rows of filled jars along the wall, the morning check-in just wrapping up, Clara's written list of household addresses with notations in several different hands. Mara was at the far end of the room checking a pot when she noticed him. She left what she was doing and came over. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Better than I should," he said. He was still looking at the room. "When did this happen?" 8 days ago." "How many people?" "We have 14 volunteers rotating through the kitchen, 8 people doing household rounds. Werner Dreyer built a sled to carry the heavier loads in the snow." She paused. "Production is up to 60 quarts a day. We're reaching every household in Iron Ridge on a 2-day rotation." Crane was quiet for a long moment. "In 8 days," he said. "People were ready," she said. "They just needed someone to show them the shape of it." He looked at her. She had known, in an abstract way, what Crane thought of her. Not dismissive, not cruel, but operating from the assumption that the relevant expertise in a medical crisis was the kind that came with formal training, and that a woman with a cellar full of food and a grandmother's knowledge of herbs was helpful in a support role, and no more than that. She had watched that assumption shift over the past weeks, not all at once, but incrementally, the way most real changes happened. And now he was standing in the doorway of the community kitchen and looking at something she had built, and she could see the final increment of that shift happening in his face. "I want to discuss formalizing this," he said. "Not just for the crisis, for after." He paused. "If you're willing." "I told Ruth the same thing," she said. "Let's get through the winter first." He nodded. "Fair enough." He turned back to the room. "What do you need from me today?" "The Hendrickson woman on the north end. She's been refusing nursing visits. I don't know if it's pride or something else, but she hasn't let anyone in for a week. I think you might have more luck than I do." "I'll go this morning. Take broth," she said. "Warm, in a covered jar so it stays hot on the walk." He took the jar she handed him and went out into the cold, and Mara went back to her pot. And the kitchen ran, imperfect and loud, and almost enough. Tease. Gavin came to the kitchen on the afternoon of the 10th day. He had been working. She knew this, knew it from the state he arrived home in each evening, the cold in his coat and the tired around his eyes, and the specific quality of exhaustion that came from physical work in brutal conditions. He had been doing the logistics that Tom Briggs had nominally taken over, but that required more actual labor than Tom Briggs had perhaps anticipated. Coordinating the supply deliveries from the ranch, keeping the store's back room stocked with raw materials, managing the flow of bones and salt and firewood and water that the kitchen consumed at a rate that even Mara found somewhat staggering. He came in during the afternoon when the second shift was running and the kitchen was loud with the productive noise of people who had found their rhythm. He stood near the door for a moment, and then he moved through the room to where Mara was, and he stood beside her at the work surface. "The Sorensen farm came in," he said. She looked up. The Sorensen farm was 3 miles out of town, on the road south, and had been cut off for most of December by the drifts. "How are they?" "Healthy," he said. But lo, they had no idea what was happening in town. He paused. I brought them back with me, Ingrid and her 2 boys. Her husband is staying with the animals. I put them in our house. She looked at him. There's room, he said. There was a slight defensiveness in it, as though he expected her to argue. And they need a warm place. And the boys, Ingrid said the boys want to help. They're 15 and 17. They can work. Mara looked at her husband, at the lean, practical man who had sat at her kitchen table 7 weeks ago and told her she was putting up too much food for 2 people, who had been, for 9 years, a good enough husband in all the practical ways and absent in some of the more essential ones, who had spent 2 months watching her do something he had dismissed as excessive and discovering that it was the thing keeping their neighbors alive, and who was standing in a community kitchen on a cold December afternoon, having brought home a family who needed shelter without asking anyone's permission, including hers. Thank you, she said. He looked slightly surprised, as though he'd been bracing for a different kind of response. They need boots, he said after a moment. Ingrid's boots are done. I told her you might have something. I have something, Mara said. I'll look tonight. He nodded. He stayed a few minutes more, helping move a crate without being asked, and then he left, and Mara watched him go with the particular feeling of someone who is discovering, slowly, that a familiar thing has become something they did not entirely expect. She didn't have a name for what was happening between them. She wasn't sure she needed one yet. She just knew that it was different, and that different was not nothing. The cold broke briefly on the 28th of December, giving Iron Ridge 1 day of temperature that was merely severe instead of brutal, and Mara used the break to go out to the dryer place with Werner and do a proper check on the livestock and assess what they had for the next leg of winter. She stood in the dryer barn with the smell of hay and animal warmth around her, and she thought about what she knew and what she still didn't know. The illness was not over, right? There were still patients in the schoolhouse, still households she was worried about, still the particular danger of the second half of winter when people's reserves were low and their bodies were tired and even ordinary cold could become serious. She had been through enough to know that a crisis didn't end cleanly. It tapered, and then it resurged, and then it tapered again, and you didn't know you were past the worst of it until you were well clear of it. But something had changed in Iron Ridge. She could feel it the way she felt weather. Not seeing it exactly, but sensing it in the air, in the quality of how people moved and spoke and looked at each other. The community kitchen had been open for 10 days, and it had done something that she hadn't fully anticipated. It had given people a place to be useful, and being useful had done something to the fear. Not removed it. Fear in a crisis was rational, and she didn't trust communities that pretended otherwise, but changed its shape. People who had something to do with their hands were less likely to be consumed by what they couldn't control. Werner had said something to her the day before that she had been thinking about since. You know what's different now? He'd said. They were walking the route, and he'd been quiet for a while in the way that meant he was thinking rather than merely being companionable. When my family was sick, when I was down on the floor and my parents were in the bed and the fire was out, I thought that was just how it was, that we were alone in it. That's just what this life was. He paused. And now I don't think that anymore. She had walked beside him without answering, and he hadn't seemed to expect an answer, and they had made the rest of the route in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other. She thought about that now, in the dryer barn, with the horses moving in their stalls and the winter light coming gray and thin through the gap in the door. She thought about her grandmother, who had kept a cellar not because she was unusual or gifted, but because it was what the women in her family had always done, had always known needed to be done. The long, quiet, unglamorous work of making sure that the people around you had what they needed to survive. The barn was cold. She needed to get back. She picked up the inventory she'd been making and started walking. The new year came to Iron Ridge without ceremony. There was no gathering, no celebration, no one standing outside in the cold watching the sky as if the turning of a calendar page might announce itself with some visible change. People went to sleep on the 31st of December and woke on the 1st of January, and the snow was still there, and the sick were still sick, and the kitchen still needed its morning shift. If anything marked the transition, it was this. Mara woke before 4 in the morning, lay in the dark for a moment listening to the wind, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, we are going to come through this. Not everyone. She knew that. She carried Seth Henderson with her every day, and the two others she'd lost in December. A widow named Florence Marsh, 73 years old, whose heart had given out under the strain of the illness, and a young man from the saloon whose name she had known only slightly, and whose absence she felt anyway. 3 people, out of 230. She was not indifferent to that number. She turned it over in her mind at odd moments. The way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath, and what was underneath, was always the same question. Could it have been fewer? But the other number, the one she had been quietly tracking since December, the one that existed in contrast to what was happening in the settlements to the north and east of Iron Ridge, the one she was hearing about through travelers and the occasional rider who made it through, that number meant something too. 3 out of 230. The settlement at Harrow Creek, 20 miles north, had lost 11 people in December. The farming community at Elk Bend, to the east, had lost 7. These were places of comparable size, comparable resources, comparable distance from help. The difference was not luck. Mara knew it was not luck, and the knowing sat heavy and complicated in her chest because she didn't know how to hold both things at once. The grief for the 3 she had lost, and the grim, uncomfortable arithmetic of the ones she hadn't. She got up before 4 and went to the kitchen and built the fire and started the morning's first pot. The community kitchen had been running for 12 days when Crane came to her with numbers of his own. He had been doing what doctors do, keeping records, because records were how you learned and how you justified and how you communicated with the world outside the immediate crisis. He had a ledger, the same cramped and efficient hand she'd seen on his desk weeks ago, and he set it on the work surface in the back room of the Alderman store one afternoon and opened it to a page covered in columns. Admitted to the schoolhouse, he said, 31 patients over the course of December. Of those, 4 died. Seth Henderson, Florence Marsh, and 2 others. The remaining 27 recovered and were discharged. He paused. I've also been tracking the household cases, the ones that were managed at home on the rounds, rather than being admitted. 64 cases that I know of, likely more that went unreported. Of those 64, 3 died. He looked up from the ledger. The mortality rate among the patients receiving regular broth and herb treatments is approximately half that of the ones who did not. Mara looked at the numbers. Approximately. Approximately. I want to be precise about what the data shows and what it doesn't. This is not a controlled study. There are too many variables. I can't tell you with medical certainty that the broth is the causal factor rather than the overall quality of nursing care, or the earlier intervention, or a dozen other things. What I can tell you is that the number is real. He closed the ledger. What you've built here has saved lives. That's not my opinion. That's what the numbers say. She absorbed this. It should have felt like validation. And part of her recognized it as that, recognized the weight of years of dismissal and the specific satisfaction of being proven right in the most concrete possible way. But it was tangled up with the deaths in a way that she couldn't separate. Every number in Crane's ledger was a person. Every recovery was a person, and so was every loss. And she couldn't feel the wins without feeling the losses underneath them. What about February? She asked. He blinked. What about it? We're 2 weeks into January. The worst of the illness may be over, or it may come back before spring. And even if the illness doesn't come back, the cold will, and the people who've been sick are going to be weaker going into the back half of winter than they were going into the front. She looked at the rows of jars on the wall. We need to think about February. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, you were thinking about February and August. I was thinking about February and August, she agreed. What do you need? She told him. January in Iron Ridge was a month of slow, grinding recovery, punctuated by setbacks that arrived without warning and required everything the community kitchen had built to absorb without collapse. The first setback came in the second week. A family on the south end that Mara had believed to be past the worst of it sent word that their youngest, a girl of 3, had taken a turn. Mara arrived to find the child burning up, the fever higher than anything she'd seen in a patient who'd survived it. She spent the night there, doing everything she knew, and the child's mother sat on the other side of the cot and watched Mara work with a face that was so stripped of everything except fear that it was almost hard to look at directly. The girl's name was Anna. She was small and dark-haired and had been, according to her mother, absolutely relentless about walking everywhere on her own 2 feet from the moment she could stand, and had an opinion about everything, and had called the family's rooster by a long, complicated name that she had invented and refused to explain. Mara talked to Anna through the night. Not because she thought the child could hear her, she wasn't sure about that either way, but because silence felt wrong, and because the mother needed to hear someone talking to her daughter in a tone of voice that was not desperate. She talked about summer, about the way the valley looked in June, when the snow was finally gone from the lower elevations and the grass came up fast and almost shocking green, and the wildflowers on the ridge were so thick you couldn't walk without stepping on them. She talked about what Anna would see when spring came, and what the rooster would do when the weather turned warm and he didn't have to spend the day huddled against the barn wall. She talked about ordinary things, and she kept her hands steady, and she kept the compresses cool and the broth warm, and she watched the child breathe. The fever broke at dawn, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Anna's temperature simply began to come down, slowly, and her breathing eased, and by the time the gray winter light was coming through the window, she was sleeping properly. The good sleep, the restoring kind, not the shallow, fitful sleep of a body in crisis. Her mother put her face down on the edge of the cot and shook silently for a long time, and Mara sat back in her chair and closed her eyes and let herself be tired for the 10 minutes before she needed to get up and do the morning rote. She did not call it a miracle. She called it the fever breaking, which was what it was. But she held it carefully, the way you hold something that could easily have gone the other way. The second setback was not medical, it was social, which in some ways was harder. It came in the form of a conversation at the kitchen's morning check-in on the 14th of January, when one of the volunteer teams, the 3 men from the South End who had recovered from their own illness and had been reliable on the household rounds for 3 weeks, announced that they were pulling back. The man who spoke for the group was named Douglas Hale, and he was not a bad man, just a tired one, and his reason was not unreasonable. His wife had been managing their household and their animals alone for most of a month, and she was exhausted, and he felt he owed it to her to be home more. Mara understood this. She said so. But the conversation that followed it was harder, because 2 other volunteers used Douglas Hale's announcement as an opening to raise something that had been building, she could tell, for a while. The sense that the crisis was over, that the worst had passed, that it was time to start pulling back toward normal life and letting families manage for themselves again. She stood at the front of the morning check-in and listened to this and felt something that was not quite anger, but was in the same family. "We lost 3 people in December," she said, when the voices had settled. "The Harrow Creek settlement lost 11. I've been trying to understand that gap, why it's so large, what accounts for it. And the best answer I have is this room, this kitchen, the roots, the fact that no house in Iron Ridge has gone more than 2 days without a check since we started." She looked around the room. We are in the middle of January. The back half of winter is where the people who were sick in December are going to feel it. Their bodies are depleted. They're going into the cold without the reserves they had in the fall. If we pull back now, "You can't keep people here indefinitely," someone said. From the middle of the room, she didn't catch who. "People have their own lives, their own—" "I know," she said, not sharply. "I know that. I'm not asking for indefinitely. I'm asking for another 6 weeks, until the thaw is real and the pass is open and the supply wagons can get through with what Dr. Crane has been waiting for since November." She paused. 6 weeks. And I'm not asking anyone to do more than they're doing. I'm asking them not to do less. The room was quiet. Clara Finch said from the side, "I'm staying." Werner Dreyer, "I'm staying." Helena Kowalski, without looking up from the list she was annotating. "Same." Douglas Hale said he'd talked to his wife, which was honest and fair. He came back the next morning and said his wife had said what she'd said, and then she'd said also that she'd come in herself 3 mornings a week to help with the kitchen, if that would help. It would help. Mara told him so. It was Tom Briggs who brought her the news about Harrow Creek. He came to the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of January, and he had the look on him that she had come to associate with news he wasn't sure how to deliver, a certain stillness, a careful choosing of where to put his hands. He waited until the afternoon shift had cleared out to say it. "Ryder came through this morning," he said. "From the north. Harrow Creek." He paused. "They're in a bad way. The illness has come back through, second wave. From what this writer says, they've lost 6 more people in the past 10 days. They're out of food. The families that could have shared with each other in December didn't, and now the ones who saved their stores are running low, and the ones who gave them away in the beginning are empty. He stopped. They're asking for help. Mara stood very still. How many people in Harrow Creek? She asked. About 160. She did the calculation. It was not a simple one. It involved what she had, what she was producing, what Iron Ridge still needed to get through the remaining weeks of winter, and what it would mean to extend the kitchen's reach 20 miles north in conditions that made 20 miles a serious undertaking. She stood with the calculation for a moment, turning it over. We can't send enough to solve it, she said. Not from here. No, Tom agreed. But we can send enough to matter, and we can send someone to show them the system. She looked at him. Can you spare men for the travel? The roads north are going to be bad. Tom Briggs, who had told Gavin Mercer to get his wife out of the kitchen more, who had shown up at the meeting in the schoolhouse with crossed arms and left it having pledged to steer, who had spent the past 3 weeks in a logistical role that suited him better than he would ever admit. Tom Briggs looked at Mara Whitlock and said, I can spare men. Good, she said. I'll put together what we can spare from stores. And Werner should go, He knows the system, and he can explain it better than anyone who hasn't been doing it. But I need to talk to him first. She went to find Werner. Werner was reluctant and honest about why. It's not that I don't want to help them, he said. They were standing outside the store, in the cold, because the kitchen was occupied. His breath made clouds in the air between them. It's that I don't know those people. And I've been doing this for 3 weeks, and it feels like it matters here. And I know it'll matter there, but... He stopped. I don't know. It's selfish. It's human, Mara said. He looked at her. Is there a difference? She thought about it. Not always, she admitted, but in this case, the selfish thing and the useful thing aren't the same, so you have to decide which one you're going to do. A long pause. Werner looked at the sky, which was the flat white of a storm, considering itself. Can Jonas go with me? Jonas was his younger cousin, who had arrived from the West End in early January and had become part of the kitchen rotation without anyone quite planning it. Yes. And you'll tell me exactly what to show them? Not just the broth, the whole system, the rounds, the list, all of it. I'll write it down, she said. Everything. You can take the paper with you. Werner exhaled. All right, he said. When do we leave? 2 days. Tom's men will know the roads. He nodded and went back inside, and Mara stood in the cold a moment longer, looking north, thinking about 160 people 20 miles away who had spent December doing what the frontier expected of them, every family for itself, and were now in the second wave of the illness with empty stores and no system. She thought about Seth Henderson, who had not wanted to make a fuss. She went inside and started writing down everything she knew. Gavin read the pages she'd written over her shoulder without being asked to. She became aware of him standing behind her after she'd been writing for about half an hour, and she didn't stop or acknowledge it, just kept writing, and he stood there for a few minutes and then pulled up a chair and sat down beside her at the table. You're giving them everything, he said, everything you know. Yes. What if they do it wrong? Then I'll write it more clearly. She kept writing, and Werner will be there to show them. He was quiet. She finished the section she was on and turned the page. I've been thinking, Gavin said. She waited. About what you said, back in November, that first night of the storm, when you sat up making plans. He paused. You said you'd been preparing since August. You said you didn't know what for exactly. You just knew something was coming. I remember. How did you know? She set down her pen. It was a question she had been asked before, by Agnes, by Werner, and she had given different versions of the same answer. The elk, the berries, the sky. Old Hector Boss. All of which was true, but incomplete. My grandmother used to say, she said, that the world is always telling you what it's going to do. Most people don't listen because they're too busy with what's right in front of them. The listening is a habit. You build it over years. Gavin looked at the table. I wasn't listening, he said. No, she agreed. It wasn't an accusation. Just a fact, delivered with the same flatness he used for facts. I don't know if I can learn to listen the way you do, he said. You don't have to listen the same way, she said. You just have to trust that someone who does is telling you something worth hearing. A long pause. Outside, the wind had come up again, testing the corners of the house. I'm going to do better with that, he said. She picked up her pen. I know, she said. She went back to writing, and he stayed at the table, and neither of them said anything more. But the silence between them was a different quality than the silences of December, and she was aware of the difference even while she was working. Werner and Jonas left for Harrow Creek on a Thursday morning with 2 of Tom Briggs's men and a loaded sled carrying 30 quarts of broth, 50 pounds of dried beans and salt meat, a supply of dried herbs with written instructions, and 12 pages of Mara's handwriting. She watched them go from the store's back doorway and felt the complex thing that came with sending something you'd built into conditions you couldn't control. She had done what she could. Whether it would be enough in a place she'd never been, with people she didn't know, in conditions nobody could fully predict, that was out of her hands, and she was accustomed to accepting that mostly, but it didn't make it comfortable. She went back to the morning shift. The third week of January brought 2 things simultaneously: the coldest night of the entire winter, a temperature that nobody in Iron Ridge had any desire to put a precise number to, and the unmistakable beginning of the illness's retreat. The cold night was brutal and practical, a test that the community kitchen met by ensuring that every house in Iron Ridge had adequate firewood and that nobody was sleeping in a room where the fire could go out undetected. It required a night shift that nobody had originally planned for, and Mara spent part of the night making rounds herself, checking on the most vulnerable households, arriving home at 3 in the morning with her eyelashes frozen and her pack empty. But the retreat of the illness, that was different. That was the thing she had been watching for, the way you watch for a change in weather you know is coming but can't predict to the hour. It showed in the numbers first: fewer new cases in the second week of January than the first, and the new cases that did appear were milder, as though the illness itself was losing some of its force. The schoolhouse was down to 3 patients. The household rounds were producing more reports of recovery and fewer reports of deterioration. Crane confirmed it at the clinic one morning with his careful precision. The acute phase appears to be ending. The remaining cases are likely to resolve over the next 2 to 3 weeks. He paused. The risk now is secondary infections. People who've had a serious respiratory illness are vulnerable to complications, especially in cold conditions. We need to maintain monitoring. We'll maintain it, Mara said. I know you will. He looked at her over the top of his ledger. I've been writing to the Medical Society in Cheyenne about what we did here, about the community kitchen, the broth preparation, the nursing system. He set the ledger down. I think there may be people who want to know about this. She was quiet for a moment. The idea of it, of what she'd built being written down and sent somewhere and read by people she'd never meet, was strange in a way she didn't entirely have language for. She had not built it to be known about. She had built it because people were sick and dying and she knew how to help and there was nothing else to do. Write what's true, she said. The broth helps sick people fight. A system of community nursing where no household is left alone for more than 2 days saves lives. People are more willing to help each other than you'd expect if you give them a structure to do it in. She paused. Write that. I'll write that, he said. It was Agnes who noticed it first, and Agnes who told Mara about it, with the particular directness of a woman who had spent 61 years saying what she meant. They're talking about you differently, Agnes said. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of the rare occasions when Mara had sat down in Agnes's kitchen for more than 10 minutes, and Agnes had made actual coffee, not the grain-based approximation they'd been making since November, because Werner had brought back a small quantity of real coffee from Harrow Creek as a kind of thank you. The smell of it was extraordinary. Talking how? Mara asked. Not that Mercer woman, Agnes said. Not Gavin's wife, the one who cooks too much. They're using your name, your actual name. She wrapped both hands around her cup. And they're saying it the way people say the name of someone they respect, which is different. You can hear the difference. Mara looked at her coffee. It doesn't change anything, she said. No, Agnes agreed. The work is the same work whether they respect you or not. That's been true since August. She took a sip. But I thought you should know anyway. Mara thought about it, about what it meant, and whether it meant what Agnes seemed to think it meant, and whether she cared. She found, examining it honestly, that she cared in a way that was smaller than she might have expected. Not because the recognition meant nothing, but because by now it had come so late and at such cost that it had lost some of the power it might have had if it had come earlier, in a different way. What she felt when she thought about the town using her name respectfully was not warm satisfaction. It was something more complicated, a kind of tired acknowledgement, the feeling of someone who ran a very long race and won it, and then sat down and realized they were mainly just glad to have finished.
How's your hip? She asked.
Agnes made a face. Better than December, worse than October. The cold doesn't help. I have an oil preparation that might ease it. I'll bring it tomorrow. Mara, Agnes said. She looked up. I want to say something, and I want you to actually hear it, not deflect it by asking about my hip or bringing me oil tomorrow. Agnes put down her cup. I have watched you work for the past 2 months. I have watched you work like I have never watched anyone work in 61 years of watching people do hard things in hard places. And I want you to know that what you did, not just the broth, not just the kitchen, but all of it, the planning, the getting up before 4 in the morning, the not giving up when you were running on nothing, it matters. It matters in a way that will still matter 20 years from now, when most of the people in this town are only starting to understand what it was. Mara sat with that for a long moment. I couldn't have done it without the people who showed up, she said finally. Werner, Helena, Clara, even Tom Briggs in his way. True, Agnes said, but they showed up because you built something worth showing up for. That's the part that was yours. She picked up her coffee again. Don't let anyone take that from you, including yourself. Mara looked at the cup in her hands. The coffee was hot, and it was real coffee, and it smelled like something that belonged to a different season. Thank you, she said. Agnes waved a hand. Now tell me what the situation is at the schoolhouse. I've been hearing things. The public moment, the one that Mara had not sought and would not have chosen, happened on a Saturday in the last week of January at the community kitchen's morning check-in. She had not planned it. She rarely planned the check-ins beyond their functional purpose, which was information sharing and task assignment. But on this particular Saturday, there were more people than usual. The kitchen had become, over the past weeks, not just a production facility, but a kind of gathering place, the spot where people who had been isolated by snow and illness came together and confirmed that other people still existed, and that confirmation had its own value separate from the broth. She was in the middle of the task assignments when Gavin came in. He had not often come to the check-ins. He did his work in the background, the logistics and the supply runs and the quiet labor that kept the whole thing moving, and he was not a man who sought public settings. But he came in on this Saturday and stood near the back of the room, and the people around him noticed and made space, and there was a quality to how he came in that made Mara pause in what she was saying. He waited until she had finished. Then he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, in the way he said things, flat and direct and without performance, I want to say something. The room went quiet. I've been telling the supply logistics for this operation since we started it, he said. And before that, I spent a long time thinking my wife was wrong, that she was wasting food, that what she was doing down in that cellar was excessive and impractical, and he stopped. He was looking at some point slightly above the heads of the people between him and Mara, and she could see the effort it was taking him, not because he was emotional, but because he was a man who had constructed his life around not saying things like this in front of 30 people. I said things about her, to people in this room and to people outside it. I made her feel that what she was doing wasn't worth doing. He paused. I was wrong about all of it. And I should have said that earlier and said it where people could hear it. The room was completely silent. He looked at Mara. What you did, what you built, what you knew before any of the rest of us knew anything. It saved people's lives, our neighbors' lives. And I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. Mara stood at the front of the room and looked at her husband and felt something move through her that was not simple and not small. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness implied she had been withholding something, and she didn't think she had been. It was more like a settling, the way a house settles into its foundation over years. The small shifts that you don't notice individually, but that add up to something solid. She didn't say anything in response, not because she had nothing to say, but because there were 30 people in the room and some things were not for 30 people. She would say what she had to say later, in their kitchen, in the quiet of their own house. What she said to the room was, "Werner, what's the status on the Western Quarter?" And the morning check-in continued, and people went out to do their work, and Gavin stayed and helped move crates without being asked. Word came from Harrow Creek on the 29th of January, carried by Jonas, who had ridden back ahead of Werner to report. The system had taken hold. It had not taken hold easily. Jonas described 2 days of resistance, of people who had their own ways of doing things and didn't want to be told by a pair of strangers from the south what those ways should be. But it had taken hold. The community kitchen was running. The household rounds were established. The second wave of illness, which had been devastating when Werner and Jonas arrived, was being managed. Werner says 6 more weeks and they'll be through it, Jonas told Mara, if the supplies hold. Will they? He hesitated. Probably, if nothing goes wrong. Something going wrong was always the condition on the frontier. Mara sent back with Jonas another 10 quarts of broth concentrate, which could be extended with water to triple its volume, and another set of written instructions. And a message for Werner that said simply, "Keep going, come home safe." She watched Jonas ride north again and thought about Werner Dreyer, who 6 weeks ago had been lying on the floor of his parents' house with the fire out and no one coming, who had gotten up when he could stand and come to ask what he could carry, who was now 20 miles north in a place he'd never been, teaching strangers a system built from his own recovery. The world was strange. She had known this, but it struck her freshly sometimes. The last week of January brought a change that was not dramatic, but was unmistakable to anyone who had been paying attention to the sky. The light was different, not warmer. The temperature was still brutal and would be for weeks. But the angle of it had shifted, the way it shifted every year at this point in winter, the imperceptible tipping of the earth that meant the worst was behind you even while the cold remained. Mara noticed it on a Wednesday morning, the light coming through the kitchen window at a slightly different angle than it had the week before, landing on the floor in a shape she hadn't seen since October. She stood looking at it for a moment. The kitchen was warm, the fire was good. From down the hall, she could hear Ingrid Sorensen's boys moving around. They had been staying in the house for 3 weeks now, and she had gotten used to the sound of other people in her space in a way she hadn't expected to. Ingrid herself was up early, as she always was, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later and saw Mara standing looking at the light on the floor. "What is it?" Ingrid asked. "Nothing," Mara said. "Just the light." Ingrid looked at the window. "It's changing," she said. "Yes." Ingrid was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the stove and started the morning coffee without being asked, which was one of the things Mara had come to appreciate about her, the quality of doing without being asked, and the two women stood in the kitchen together in the early morning and watched the light change on the floor. Outside, Iron Ridge was still deep in snow, and the sick were still recovering, and the community kitchen still had a morning shift that needed running, and there were households on the route that would need checking, and February was coming, and she had been right to worry about February. But the light was different, and she had learned from women who had learned it before her that you paid attention to the light. She poured coffee and went to the table and opened her ledger to the page she needed and started the day. February came in the way Mara had predicted, which was to say it came hard. Not with fresh illness. The respiratory sickness that had torn through Iron Ridge in December had largely burned itself out, leaving behind the recovering and the weakened and the grief of the families who had lost someone and were learning to reorganize themselves around that absence. What February brought was the particular cruelty of a winter that had already taken everything and then kept going. The cold that settled into structures and bodies that had been fighting it for 3 months. The firewood supplies running lower than anyone had planned for. The physical and psychological exhaustion of a community that had been in crisis mode since November and was beginning to fray at the edges in ways that had nothing to do with illness. She had been right to worry about February. She had known she would be. The community kitchen was still running, but the people running it were tired in a way that December's urgency had partially masked. In December, the crisis had its own terrible energy. The adrenaline of immediate need. The focus that comes when the alternative to functioning is someone dying. February didn't have that. February had instead the grinding, undramatic difficulty of continuing to do hard work when the worst appeared to be over and the body and the mind were both making their case for stopping. Mara understood this. She felt it herself, the pull toward rest that had been accumulating since August. Nearly 6 months of rising before 4 and carrying heavy things through the snow and making decisions that she was not entirely qualified to make, and doing it anyway because there was no one else. She had a recurring sensation in her hands now, a deep ache in the joints that she recognized from watching her mother's hands in the last years of her life, and she knew what it meant, and she noted it and kept working. But she also knew that what a community needed in February was different from what it had needed in December, and that if she tried to run February like December, she would lose people. Not to illness, but to the ordinary human limits of endurance and obligation and the reasonable desire to sleep past 4 in the morning. So she adjusted. She reduced the kitchen shifts from 3 rotations to 2, and she cut the length of each shift. She restructured the household rounds so that no volunteer was making more than 4 stops per circuit, which meant more volunteers doing shorter routes rather than fewer volunteers doing longer ones. She started something that she hadn't had time for in December. A brief rest period at the kitchen each morning after the check-in, just 20 minutes, where people sat down and had coffee and talked about something that had nothing to do with illness or broth or firewood allocation. She had understood, from watching people for 3 months, that what wore them out was not just the physical work, but the unrelenting weight of the purpose. The fact that every task was charged with the knowledge that it mattered, that someone's life or health depended on it being done correctly. 20 minutes of talking about something ordinary did something to that weight. Not much. Enough. Clara Finch was the one who named it. "You're keeping us human," Clara said one morning during the rest period when most people were talking and Mara was sitting slightly apart, watching. Mara looked at her. "The 20 minutes," Clara said. "That's what it's for. Not just rest. You're reminding us that we're people, not just workers." Mara thought about this. "My grandmother used to say you can't pour from an empty vessel," she said. "But I always thought that was only about the practical, the food, the rest, the basic physical maintenance." She paused. I think she meant more than that. Clara, who had come from Ohio and had a teacher's habit of sitting with ideas rather than rushing past them, nodded slowly. "What we're doing here," she said. "All of it. The kitchen, the roots, the way people are taking care of each other. It's going to change after winter, isn't it?" "I think it might," Mara said. "Is that what you wanted? When you started preparing in August, were you thinking about what came after?" Mara was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was no. In August, she had been thinking about survival, the immediate concrete question of whether people in Iron Ridge would have what they needed to get through a bad winter. She had not been thinking about permanence. She had not been thinking about legacy or institution or any of the larger words that people sometimes applied to things after the fact. She had been thinking about bones and broth and the way the elk were moving wrong. "No," she said. "I was just trying to make sure people didn't die." Clara smiled. "Well," she said, "you did that, and some things followed from it that maybe you didn't plan." Werner came back from Harrow Creek on the 9th of February, thinner than he'd left, and with a quality about him that Mara recognized as the particular gravity that comes from having done something hard in a place where nobody knew you and having done it well. He came to the kitchen first before going home and stood in the doorway of the Alderman store's back room with his hat in his hands in the way she'd first seen him when he came to tell her about Crane collapsing. "How are they?" she asked. "Alive," he said. "More of them than would have been without the system." He was quiet a moment. "Lost 4 people before we got there. Since then, 2 more. It's not nothing, but the rate dropped." "Did the kitchen hold?" "It held. A woman named Pearl Weston. She's been running it since the 3rd day. She had her own ideas about some things, and she did them her way, and I let her because her way worked." He almost smiled. "She reminded me of you, a little. Not in how she looks or how she talks, just the way she moves through a room like she already knows what needs doing." Mara thought about Pearl Weston in Harrow Creek, a woman she'd never meet, running a kitchen she'd never see, with 12 pages of instructions and her own ideas, and the same fundamental understanding that the women in Mara's family had been carrying for 100 years. That caring for people was not a small thing, or a domestic thing, or a thing that happened in the background of real life. that it was, in fact, the most essential infrastructure a community had.
Good, she said. She should do it her way.
Werner nodded. He came in and took off his coat and went to the morning shift without being asked. The thaw, when it finally came, arrived the way thaws on the high plains always did. Not as a single event, but as a series of days that were slightly less cold than the ones before, a slow loosening of the winter's grip that was unmistakable once you knew what to look for, but was easy to miss if you were watching for something dramatic. Mara had been watching for it since February, tracking it the way she tracked everything, by the quality of the light in the morning, by the sound the snow made when she walked on it, by the way the brothers began to emerge from the white haze as the visibility improved, first as darker shapes against the sky, then as the familiar ridgeline she had been living underneath for 9 years. In the first week of March, the temperature rose above freezing for 3 consecutive days. The snow on the south-facing slopes began to soften. Water appeared at the edge of roof lines and dripped steadily into the snow below, making small craters that expanded hour by hour. Mara stood at the kitchen window on the morning of the 4th day and watched a crow land on the fence post at the edge of the yard. It had been weeks since she'd seen a crow. They came back before most things did, the crows. They were not sentimental about winter, did not wait for a guarantee of warmth before they reappeared. They simply came when the conditions tipped, following whatever calculation they made in their crow minds about when the world was viable again. She watched the crow for a moment. Then she went and woke Gavin. "The crow is back," she said. He blinked at her from the pillow. It took him a moment, and then he understood what she meant. Not the literal crow, or not only that, and he sat up. "How long until the pass is open?" he asked.
2 weeks, maybe 3.
Depends on how the melt goes on the northern side. She sat on the edge of the bed. "Crane's medicine order will get through, the supply wagons from the east." She paused. "The Sorensens can go home." They had been in the house for 2 months, Ingrid and her boys, and while it had never stopped being strange, the particular strangeness of sharing a house that had always been just 2 people, it had also become something she wouldn't have expected in November, which was comfortable. The boys had done more work than she'd asked of them and complained about less than she'd expected. Ingrid had become the kind of presence in the kitchen that Mara had not known she was missing until it was there, a second person who understood the work without having to be explained to. "She'll want to stay," Gavin said. He meant Ingrid. He had said it the way he said things he had already decided were true. "She has her own house," Mara said. "Her own house is 3 miles out on a road that washes out every spring. Her husband manages the farm, but the boys are old enough to help more if they're not out there." He paused. "I told her she could stay, if she wanted, permanently." Mara looked at him. "I should have asked you first," he said. Not apologetically, just as a statement of fact, the way he acknowledged things that were true. "I'm telling you now." She thought about it, about the changed shape of the house over the past 2 months, the sounds of other people in the morning, the second coffee cup, the evenings when the 5 of them sat around the table and the conversation was easier than it had been when it was just 2. She thought about what she had said to Clara about empty vessels and about what it meant to be full. "She can stay," Mara said. Gavin nodded. He lay back down. "The crow," he said. "Does it always come back this early?"
"The smart ones do," she said.
The meeting about the permanent community kitchen happened on the 14th of March, 2 days after the first supply wagon made it through from the east with Crane's medicine order and 3 bolts of cloth and a barrel of real coffee that made Ruth Alderman cry a little when she unpacked it, which she later said was purely a reaction to the smell. It was a larger meeting than the one in January. 47 people, almost a quarter of Iron Ridge's surviving population, which was something that would not have happened 6 months ago. People on the frontier did not gather voluntarily in numbers, unless there was commerce involved or something had gone badly wrong. That 47 people came to a meeting in March to talk about what came next was itself a kind of evidence, though evidence of what was something she was still working out. Crane opened it because Crane had organizational authority and Mara didn't, and because she had told him that she preferred it that way. Not from false modesty, but from genuine understanding of how institutions worked and what gave them legitimacy. A doctor proposing a community health initiative was something that Iron Ridge could absorb and support. A woman who cooked proposing the same thing was something that would require more work from people who still weren't entirely sure what to make of her, and she was tired enough that she didn't want to spend the energy on that fight if she didn't have to. Crane was brief and precise, which was his way. What they had built over the winter, what it had done, what the numbers showed, what it would require to continue it in a modified form through the spring and beyond. Then he said, Mara Whitlock is the reason any of this exists. I'd like her to say what she thinks it should become. She had not prepared a speech. She had made, over the previous days, a set of notes, practical notes, the kind she always made, about what the kitchen would need to function on an ongoing basis, and how the household monitoring system could be maintained at a lower intensity than it had operated in the winter. She had not tried to write anything about what it meant or what it should be called or what Iron Ridge should understand about how it had survived. She stood up and she looked at the 47 people in the room, Werner and Helena and Clara and Agnes and Tom Briggs and Carl Whitmore and Gavin at the back and the Sorensen boys and Nora Henderson, who had come alone and sat in the second row with her daughters on either side of her. And she thought about what was true, and she said that. What we built this winter was not complicated, she said. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a tendency to make it sound like something unusual, like I had knowledge or gifts that other people don't have. She paused. I didn't. I had a cellar and a grandmother who taught me to fill it and the habit of paying attention to things. That's all. What happened here happened because all of you decided that paying attention to your neighbors was worth your time. She stopped. Most of what we did this winter is what people used to do before the frontier told us we had to do everything alone. The community kitchen, the rounds, the system for making sure no household was invisible, none of that is new. It's old, older than this country probably. We just forgot it for a while. The room was quiet. What I want it to become, she continued, is something that doesn't need a catastrophe to justify its existence. A permanent kitchen, not running at winter crisis capacity, but open. A place where people who can't manage their own food production can get a meal. A place where we keep stores against bad seasons so that the next time something like this happens, and something like this will happen, this is the frontier and things happen, we don't start from nothing. She looked at the room, and a system for checking on each other, not intensive the way it was in December. Just regular. Just a baseline of knowing that nobody in this town is invisible. She sat down. Tom Briggs was the first to speak. He stood up from his chair in the way of a man who has decided what he thinks and wants it on record. I'll fund the building, he said. A proper structure, not a back room. If we're going to do this permanently, do it in something that's built for it. Ruth Alderman. The store will supply at cost. Clara Finch. I'll take the organizational records, the household list, the monitoring system. I'll maintain it. Werner Dreyer said nothing for a moment, and then he said, I want to teach people the broth. What you taught me. I want to write it down properly and teach it so that when you're not available, or I'm not available, someone else can do it. He looked at Mara. Is that all right? It was never mine to keep, she said. The vote, when Crane called it, was 46 in favor and 1 abstention. The abstention was Douglas Hale, who raised his hand to explain that he wasn't opposed, but had some concerns about the long-term costs that he wanted to discuss separately, which was a reasonable position and which Mara noted as something to follow up on. Not unanimous, not perfect, but 46 out of 47, in a town that had started the winter barely able to acknowledge its own need for other people. That was something she could work with. The last snow of winter came on the 21st of March, as though the season was making one final argument for itself. It lasted a day, deposited 3 inches, and melted by the following morning in the pale, strengthening sun. When Mara walked outside the morning after, the ground beneath the melted snow was wet and dark, and in the south-facing beds beside the house, she could see the first tentative evidence of things waking up, the hair-thin thread of something green pushing through the mud. She crouched down and looked at it for a long time. It was not a profound moment, or she didn't experience it as one. She was tired and her hands ached, and she had 3 things she needed to do before noon, and the morning coffee was waiting inside. But she stayed crouched in the mud looking at the green thread for longer than was strictly necessary, because some things deserve more than a glance, and this was one of them. She was still there when Gavin came out to the well. He saw her and stopped. "What is it?" "Something coming up," she said, "by the south wall." He came and looked over her shoulder. "Too early to tell what." "It's always too early until it's there," she said. She stood up and her knees ached and she brushed the mud off her skirt and went back inside. She thought in the weeks that followed about what Agnes had said, that the town was using her name differently now. She noticed it in the careful way she noticed most things. The way people greeted her on the street, the slight shift in register when her name came up in conversation she was adjacent to. Not reverence. She would have found reverence uncomfortable, and anyway it wasn't that. It was more like the ordinary acknowledgement that people gave to someone whose competence had been established beyond dispute. She had mixed feelings about it, which she thought was honest. On one side of the ledger, the recognition felt like something that had cost more than it should have. She had spent 9 years in this town being dismissed, being talked about, being the subject of the particular kind of social dismissal that was reserved for women who didn't fit the expected shape. And then a disaster had come and proved her right, and now they respected her. And the path from dismissed to respected had run through a winter that killed people. She could not feel entirely simple about that. On the other side, she was practical enough to know that recognition was not nothing, that the community kitchen having Mara Whitlock's name attached to it, quietly, without ceremony, simply as the person people associated with it, made it more likely to survive. Made it more likely that when she was not there to insist on it, it would continue, because the town would have a story about where it came from and what it was for. That was not vanity. That was just how things persisted in the world. They persisted through stories, and the story of how Iron Ridge had gotten through the winter of 1886 would be told as long as there were people who had lived through it, and in that story she would exist, and that mattered. She held both of these things. She did not try to resolve them into something simpler. The permanent building went up in April. Tom Briggs had not been boasting when he said he'd fund it. He had a man from Cheyenne who did construction, and he brought him in with materials, and by the end of the second week of April, there was a structure on the east side of town, between the general store and the schoolhouse, that was built for exactly what it needed to be built for. A large central hearth, a work surface that could accommodate 6 people simultaneously, shelving along 2 walls, a storage room in the back for the long-term food reserves that the community would maintain going forward. Werner built the shelving himself, which nobody had asked him to do, but which he did with the same quiet determination he'd applied to everything since his recovery. He spent a week on it, and the shelving was not beautiful. It was slightly uneven in one corner, and he'd run out of a particular size of nail and substituted something that worked but didn't look the same. But it was solid, and it held weight, and it was his. Mara watched him install the last section and thought about his father's barn in December, the dark house, and the dead fire, and the 3 of them on the edge of something permanent. She thought about the distance between that and this. A man building shelving for a community kitchen because his life had been saved by someone bringing him broth, and he had decided that was a debt you paid forward rather than back. "It's good work," she told him. He looked at the shelf critically. "That corner is off by about half an inch." "It'll hold," she said. He nodded, still looking at it. "I got a letter," he said, "from Pearl Weston in Harrow Creek." He pulled it from his pocket, a single folded page, and held it without opening it. "She wants to know if I'll come back. Not permanently. Just to help them set up something like this." He gestured at the building around them. "A permanent version." Mara looked at him. "Will you?" He was quiet a moment. "I don't know what I know about any of this," he said. "I'm a farmer. I know animals and land and weather. I know a little bit about broth now, and I know how to walk a route in the snow. That doesn't seem like much to offer." "You'd be surprised," she said, "what it seems like to people who don't have it." He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. "I'll think about it," he said. She thought he would go. She thought the pull of it, of having been useful in an unexpected way, of having something to teach that he hadn't expected to know, would win out over the uncertainty. She had watched enough people discover their own usefulness in the past months to recognize the shape of it, the specific look of someone encountering a version of themselves they hadn't planned for. Werner had that look when he talked about Harrow Creek. He had it when he talked about Pearl Weston. He went in May. Nora Henderson came to the kitchen on the morning of its official opening with her two daughters, 7 and 4 now, Ellen and May. Mara was there early, as she was always there early, and she saw Nora come in and stand for a moment in the doorway looking at the space, and she knew from the quality of Nora's stillness that she was doing something internally that required the stillness, placing herself in relation to what was here, to what hadn't been here in December, to the particular weight of being a woman who had lost her husband to a winter that killed fewer people than it might have. Mara went to her. She didn't say anything, just stood beside her in the doorway for a moment, both of them looking at the kitchen, the hearth, the shelving, the morning light coming through the window that faced east. Seth would have liked this, Nora said finally. Her voice was steady in the way of voices that have been practicing steadiness for a few months and are getting better at it. Yes, Mara said. He always liked things that people built together. He said the best things were the ones where you couldn't point to a single person and say they did it. She paused. He was wrong about that, actually. I think you can usually point to someone. She looked at Mara. But I understand what he meant. Mara felt the weight of it, of Seth Henderson, 34, with 2 daughters and an opinion about community-built things, who had not wanted to make a fuss and had died because of it, or partly because of it, or anyway, in the same season as it. She did not try to make it right. There was nothing to say that would make it right. What Ellen and May learned from watching this place, Nora said, will be part of what Seth left behind. I want you to know that I think about it that way. Mara looked at the 2 girls who had found something interesting about the hearth and were examining it at close range, with the thorough investigative focus of young children encountering new things. Ellen, the older one, was explaining something to May in a low, authoritative voice, and May was listening with an expression of complete credence. Bring them often, Mara said. Nora nodded. She took her daughters by the hands and came inside. Agnes Pullman attended the opening and sat in the corner with her coffee and watched everything with the sharp, accurate attention that Mara had always admired in her, and at the end of the morning she called Mara over. Sit down, Agnes said. For 5 minutes. Just sit. Mara sat. You look better than February, Agnes said. You still look like someone who hasn't slept enough in 6 months, but better than February. I'll sleep in June, Mara said. Agnes made a sound. You'll find something else to do in June. Probably true. Mara didn't argue. I've been thinking, Agnes said, about what it is that you actually did. I don't mean the practical things, the broth, the system, all of that. I mean the thing underneath. She paused, turning her coffee cup in her hands. You believed something was real before anyone else could see it, and you acted on it anyway, without support, without agreement, for months, in the face of people, including people who were supposed to love you, telling you it wasn't worth doing. Mara said nothing. That's the harder part, Agnes said. The broth anyone can learn. The acting without permission, that's the hard part. Most people can't do it. They need consensus before they'll commit to something. They need the room to agree before they'll walk through the door. She looked at Mara directly. Why could you? Mara thought about it seriously, because Agnes asked serious questions and deserved serious answers. I don't know if it was courage, she said finally. I think it might have just been that I was more afraid of being wrong in the other direction, of having known something and done nothing about it. She paused. My grandmother said once that the cost of preparation if you're wrong is that you wasted time and supplies. The cost of not preparing if you're right is that people die. She looked at her hands. When you put it that way, the calculus isn't complicated. But most people still don't do it, Agnes said. Most people find reasons not to, Mara agreed. The judgment, the effort, the loneliness of doing something that nobody else can see the point of. She was quiet for a moment. I had those reasons too. I just had a grandmother who was louder. Agnes smiled. The real one, not the polite one. I want to be that grandmother, she said, for someone. I don't have grandchildren, but I want to be that kind of person for someone before I'm done. Mara looked at her. You've been that for me, she said, for years. Agnes was briefly, visibly, taken off guard by this. She recovered, but not quite fast enough to hide it, and Mara saw it and was glad. Well, Agnes said. Good. She drank her coffee. Now go do something. You're making me anxious just sitting here. Tone. The first community meal served from the permanent kitchen happened on a Sunday in April, and it was not a ceremony or a celebration, just a meal. Soup and bread and a pot of beans that Helena Kowalski had been working on since the previous afternoon, using a method that was adjacent to Mara's but distinctly Helena's, with different spices and a proportion of pork that Mara would not have used, and which turned out to be, frankly, better than what Mara would have done. Mara ate 2 bowls and told Helena so. Helena looked at her with the expression of someone who has been told something they wanted to hear but is slightly suspicious of it. "You're not just saying that." "I'm not a person who just says things," Mara said. "No," Helena agreed. "You're really not." She looked at the pot, which was still more than half full, with the quiet assessment of a woman evaluating her own work. The pork was Marcus's idea. He said, She stopped. "Marcus says a lot of things in the kitchen now. I don't know when he developed opinions about cooking." "He developed them in December," Mara said, "when he had nothing to do except lie in bed and watch you work." Helena laughed, a real laugh, sudden and a little surprised, the kind that comes when something lands exactly right. And Mara found herself laughing too, and then Agnes, who had overheard, made a sound from the corner that was also a laugh, and the kitchen was warm and loud and full of people eating, and outside the April light was doing what April light did in Wyoming, which was to be tentative but persistent, and a little more certain each day. Gesimen, the thing she thought about most in the months that followed, in the spring and summer of 1887, as Iron Ridge rebuilt itself into something slightly different from what it had been before the winter, was not the cellar, or the broth, or the community kitchen, or even the people she had lost, or the ones she had kept. What she thought about most was the moment in November when she had stood at the kitchen window in the dark and watched the snow falling horizontally and gone back to the table and sat down with her ledger. She had not known in that moment what was coming. She had known something was coming, had known it for months, but the specific shape of it, the respiratory illness that would sweep through town in December, the exhausted doctor who would collapse, the particular cascade of events that had required exactly the kind of preparation she had been making, with exactly the timing she had made it. None of that had been visible to her. She had just prepared, and the preparation had met the reality, and in between the two of them, something had happened that was larger than either. This was the thing she kept returning to, because it seemed important, and she had not yet finished understanding it. She had not saved Iron Ridge because she knew what was coming. She had saved Iron Ridge because she had built something useful before she knew it would be needed. And the lesson in that, the one she wanted Werner to carry to Harrow Creek and Pearl Weston to carry wherever she carried things, the one she wanted the community kitchen to represent in the years after she was gone, was not about prediction. It was not about unusual knowledge or gifts or seeing things others couldn't see. It was simpler than that, almost insultingly simple if you thought about it too hard. The people who keep others alive in the hard times are not the ones who wait to see if the hard times are coming. They are the ones who prepare as though they are, who fill the cellar when the summer is still warm and the crops are good and everyone else is telling them to relax. They are the ones who learn what the body needs before the body needs it, who build the systems before the crisis makes the systems obvious, who accept the loneliness and the judgment and the particular weariness of caring about tomorrow when everyone around them is managing today. And they are almost always the people that everyone else has underestimated, the women who cook too much, the ones who fill the cellar past the point of reason, the ones who are called excessive, anxious, impractical, right up until the moment when practical has failed and what's left is the thing they built in the background while no one was paying attention. She had carried this her whole life. She had learned it from her mother from her grandmother, and her grandmother from the women before her. An unbroken chain of knowledge passed hand to hand because it was too important to lose and not prestigious enough to be written down. And she had carried it into a marriage where it was not valued, and into a town where it was not seen, and she had kept going anyway, not out of stubbornness, but out of the understanding that the work was the work, regardless of who was watching. That was the thing she wanted to leave behind. Not the broth recipe, not the community kitchen, not her name in whatever story Iron Ridge told about the winter of 1886. Just the understanding that preparation was not pessimism, that caring for people before they needed it was not weakness or anxiety or a woman's excessive worry. That the most essential work a community did was not visible until the moment it was the only thing standing between them and the worst. She did not know how to put this into a speech or a document or a formal proposal. She put it into the kitchen and into the hours she spent teaching Werner and Helena and anyone else who wanted to learn, and into the ledger she kept, updated every month with the status of the town's collective food stores and the households she was monitoring and the things she was watching in the weather and the land that she didn't have names for yet, but that she was paying attention to. She put it into the mornings. In October of 1887, exactly 1 year after the autumn that had felt wrong, Mara went down to the cellar before dawn and stood in the lantern light and looked at the shelves. She had rebuilt the stores over the summer, not alone this time. Helena had contributed 2 months of work. Werner, back from his second trip to Harrow Creek, had spent 3 weeks on preservation. Clara Finch had organized a community canning effort that had produced more jars than any of them had individually planned for. Tom Briggs had donated bones and tallow without being asked. The shelves were full. Fuller than they'd been in August of 1886 and better organized and the product of more hands. She stood in the cellar for a moment in the familiar smell of earth and salt and the faint sweetness of the preserved fruit on the upper shelf. She held the lantern up and looked at the jars, row on row, and she thought about what each one had cost. Not in money or materials, but in the particular quiet, sustained effort of people who had decided that the work was worth doing. The autumn outside was not wrong this year. The elk were moving at the right time. The berries had ripened on schedule. The sky had none of that particular quality she had watched last year with the low, persistent alarm that had driven her down to the cellar every morning before Gavin woke. It looked like a normal Wyoming autumn. It probably was a normal Wyoming autumn. They were ready for it anyway. She closed the ledger, hung the lantern back on its hook, and went upstairs to start the day. The kitchen was already warm. Ingrid had been up before her, which had become a competition of sorts between them, friendly and unspoken. The competition of two women who both understood that the morning was when the day's foundation was laid. The coffee was on. Outside, through the kitchen window, the brothers were catching the first light, the ridgelines coming clear and clean against a sky that was a particular shade of blue that only happened in October. The blue that meant the air was cold and dry, and the day would be good. Gavin came downstairs and poured coffee and stood at the window beside her and looked at the brothers. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood together for a moment, not talking, just looking at the mountains that had always been there. The same mountains, the same valley, the same frontier that had been asking everything of everyone who came to it since before either of them had been born. It asked hard things. It had always asked hard things. It was not going to stop. But the cellar was full, and the kitchen was warm, and there were people in Iron Ridge who knew how to fill a cellar and build a kitchen and check on their neighbors before the crisis came. And when Mara thought about the year behind her and the years ahead of her, that was what she held on to. Not the recognition, not the story people told about her, not even the lives she could count on the tally she kept in her head, the fragile, real arithmetic of people who were alive because of what she had done and what she had taught, and what she had refused to stop doing even when there was no reward for it, and no audience for it, and no one who believed it mattered. Just the full cellar, and the warm kitchen, and the knowledge that she had paid attention when it counted. The crow landed on the fence post again, the same post as last March, or a different crow. She couldn't be sure. It looked at her through the window with the flat, unimpressed gaze of a crow, assessing whether something was worth its interest. She looked back. Then she picked up her coffee and her ledger and went to work.